Jonathan rested for a moment on the rocky outcropping, trying to recover enough of his mental acumen to plot a course across the lake. Using his advanced intelligence, he was able to not only see the optimal route, but also begin to understand the behavior of the monsters. It seemed that the monsters within this area were more like props than anything else, and they moved on a predetermined timer around the lake, as shown by the occasional flash of color that breached the lava every few seconds or so. They were always in the same place, and Jonathan assumed that it was intended to be so that any challenger could accurately plot a course to safety. After all, this entire exercise would have been ridiculously unfair if not for that minor concession. Most people of his level would not have been able to survive the lava at all, and he suspected that pure mage builds would have succumbed to the heat already without some sort of magical aid. He was certainly finding this to be easier than he had expected, given his innate fear of lava from his time back on Earth. Lava on Earth was one of the greatest destructive forces of nature that there was, an inexorable tide of superheated rock that could not be stopped by any force available within the world. Jonathan banished these distracting thoughts, and reminded himself of who he was. If he was back on Earth right now, he could have been akin to a god. He could survive most weapons by now, short of a nuclear explosion, which to be fair, was far beyond the normal level of power for a species such as humanity. It was really interesting comparing the abilities of this universe to his own, and they had taken quite different routes to power. Humanity could bring incredible power to bear, but they were individually pathetic. Meanwhile, a single fighter from this world was far more capable than any human, but lacked the advanced weaponry. Then again, there wasn't really any need for bombs or guns in a world where a mere bow could launch an arrow at the speed of a bullet. As Jonathan pondered this dichotomy, he prepared to jump for the next island, which was a little further away. He took a few steps back and leapt with a running start, propelling him high into the air. More of the monsters leaped up to snap at him, but he sent his void aspect man to his hands, creating balls of pure anathema. The monsters sensed this somehow, and they tried to jerk away, but they were in midair, and the attacks connected regardless of their struggles. The attacks burned straight through them, eating away at their bodies like acid. The creatures died there and then, with Jonathan's fists planted deep in their brains. He had lost most of his momentum however, and he was forced to use the monsters as a springboard before gravity could take hold of them once more. Landing on the next outcropping, he grinned. He had found quite an effective strategy. Jonathan vaulted across the next few gaps like a monkey, using the same strategy of taking the monster corpses and using them as stepping stones. He even gained a level this way, and with his new stat bonus, he really felt the added power from it. However, the monsters began to grow stronger and bigger as he neared the center, and soon he was unable to kill them with a single strike anymore. Even worse, many of them began to use their own forms of elemental mastery, and they were able to stop his void power from damaging them as much as it would have normally. He still was able to hurt them, as the void was superior to all other elements, but it was hard going. Soon he began to take damage regularly, first in the form of bruises and then cracked bones. His armor really did wonders in keeping his blood within his body, but it did little for blunt force damage. He took the pain as it came however. He had felt worse. The real problem was how the damage inhibited his movements, which could potentially lead to him taking unnecessary damage from the leviathans of the magmatic deep. Jonathan had to take a long break at the center of the lake however, on an island that was barely more than a boulder sitting in the middle of the lava. The other problem was that the islands were growing smaller and smaller, and at this rate, he would eventually have to take a dip into the lava, which would necessitate his usage of his free stat points to bolster his abilities. He would try to keep that away as long as possible however. Jonathan sized up the next rocky outcropping, which was about 100 feet away, and waited until a few monsters had lined up in his path. As he jumped, the first one leaped up towards him, a monster that looked slightly like a whale, if a whale was made out of black rock run through with stripes of glowing red. The monster opened its mouth wide and vomited a spray of red-hot rock at him, rock that actually burnt his skin when it hit, even through his armor. Jonathan hissed and landed on the creature's head, using it as a springboard for him to reach the next one. Leaping off the lava whale, the next monster emerged from the seething lava, a worm-like creature that was quite a bit more difficult to grab onto. It snapped out at Jonathan at high speeds, almost catching his left arm in its fanged maw. He punched it away as it came near, however, and swung off its head towards the final monster that he could see just below the surface. Another of the lava whales, this time even bigger than the first one, broke the surface of the lava, inhaling in preparation to cook him with its fiery vomit. Jonathan summoned his mana orbs to his hands instead, not compressing them at all. Violet flame exploded out of his hands, and as the monster vomited molten rock at Jonathan, he pointed his hands towards it. It ate up the rock like it was nothing, and Jonathan drove his fists into the shocked monster's face, vaulting over it and onto the safety of the next island. Jonathan was burnt all over from the previous attacks, and he had no levels up with which to heal himself. He would have to look into a healing ability soon after this, if such a thing was even possible to gain. He suspected that his new affinity might cause such an endeavor to be problematic. In any case, as his durability increased, his natural healing speed naturally went up as well, and eventually he would be able to heal quite quickly indeed. At this current moment, however, he would need at least a couple of minutes until he was in fighting form again. He was a bit past the halfway mark by now, but the end seemed to be ever further away than ever before. The monsters seemed to just keep getting larger and larger, and Jonathan started to wonder if this was even possible. The last challenge, with the troglodytes, had been quite hard, especially towards the end, but this was on another level. At least the lava was not immediately threatening, or else this would have been a death trap. As Jonathan recovered, he scouted out the path before him. There were about 15 more rocks left until the end of the fiery lake, and the spacing increased the further that they went. By the last rock, it looked like there was about 300 feet between it and the previous one. Jonathan might have misjudged the length of the lake by a bit. It was certainly more than a mile long now that he was looking at it properly. His injuries knit back together somewhat, and he was soon ready to fight once more. Jonathan got to his feet and fixed his position relative to the next outcropping. He bunched up his legs and jumped a moment later, already preparing his mana attacks. As the monsters rose up from the deep, he was ready, using their bodies as springboards within which to cross. Continuing in this vein over the next hour, Jonathan crossed about half of the remaining distance, and the injuries were quickly mounting. The monsters by now were too powerful to be defeated within the time frame that he possessed, and not only that, but they were strong enough to overpower him as well. He was only scraping by at this point, and his durability was being put to the test. Eventually, he caved in, and added some points to his resilience stat, doing some quick math to bolster the amount gained. At this point, using batches of 2 stat points was no longer as efficient as before, but 3 worked fine. He quickly sent 18 stat points into resilience, which, with his multipliers, sent it up by 30 points. His body began to heal over even more rapidly than before, and his skin tightened across his hardening bones. He felt invulnerable now, unbreakable. It was only an illusion created by the after effects of the stat point investment, and they quickly disappeared however. Jonathan eyed up the lava in front of him, and dove in, kicking as hard as he could. The monsters were programmed to attack things above the surface, but because of the nature of this trial, they had little freedom to do anything else. When Jonathan swam right by the first of the monsters, it took a few seconds to realize what was happening. The lava was like a hot bath to his skin at this point, and could afford to stop and linger in it for long enough to attack the creatures lurking there. He drove one fist into its head, slowed down somewhat by the mana. However, the lava could not impede his void aspect attack, and it carved through flesh and bone alike. The monster was now aware of the threat, and it lashed out, but now that it was underwater, and unable to catch Jonathan in the air, where he was more vulnerable, its size worked against it. Jonathan quickly finished it off, driving both fists into its brain. Essence rushed into him, almost leveling him up again. However, more of the monsters had been drawn by the fight, and he decided against doing such a thing in the future. He kicked wildly, propelling himself at high speeds through the viscous lava. He reached the next island at record speed, and he estimated that he had been swimming at upwards of 100 miles per hour, which was quite impressive, given that he was swimming in lava. He really was above and beyond anything he had ever known before coming to this world. He quickly flipped up onto the rock, which was barely large enough to sit on, and recovered some of his mana and stamina as he waited. There had been no injuries from that dive, save for a light reddening of his skin. He guessed that the system had not accounted for the fact that someone would have such high resilience and still have enough in their other stats to fight on an equal level with the monsters in this dungeon. The lava was meant to be an obstacle, but to Jonathan, it was actually an efficient means of crossing the lake. Jonathan swam for the rest of the lake, using the islands as resting spots for him to stop by. By the time that he had reached the final island, he was feeling pretty good about himself. He was hovering on the brink of level 50 now, and he knew that when he crossed it, something would be in store for him. He prepared to make the final crossing, but the lava in front of him suddenly cooled to black rock, and a figure stepped out of a rent in the air in front of him. It looked like a classical demon, with red skin, horns, and a long tail. In its hands, it wielded twin axes, which glowed with an infernal light. However, it was clearly not sapient, and its eyes glowed with madness. It roared at Jonathan, and charged him, its axes held high. He coated his fists in mana, and charged the monster, roaring in return. He upped his speed as he neared the creature, surprising it with his turn of speed. The monster was caught off guard by his next attack, which came rocketing towards its abdomen, rendered vulnerable by the way that it was holding its axes. The monster had no skill whatsoever with its weapons, and it seemed to be just something that the system had tacked onto the creature to make it more imposing. It lashed out with the axes, but Jonathan dodged them easily. The creature snorted, and red light limned its form, causing it to speed up dramatically. It made up for quality with sheer quantity of attacks, driving Jonathan backwards with a wild flurry of axe strikes. The ones that got through left large cuts on his body, even through his armor, which told him that they were enchanted somewhat. He marshaled himself and entered his battle meditation state, calming himself down forcibly so that he could see what his enemy was doing. He began to react to the monster's fighting style more accurately over the next few seconds, and he soon was able to predict where the strikes would come in. It appeared totally random at first, but there were a few patterns thrown in with the wild swinging that the monster was using against Jonathan. He eventually drove his fist home into the demon's stomach, blasting it backwards and tearing out a great chunk of red flesh with his void mana. The monster howled in rage, and raced back towards Jonathan, ignoring the hole in its stomach. Jonathan bent low as it came near, and then exploded upwards, seizing its leading arm and twisting it up and over his head. He slammed it into the stone beneath them, surprised at how light it was. He started to swing the monster again and again, building up momentum. It writhed in his grip and cut him with its axes, but he kept at it, breaking bones and crushing flesh. By the time that he was finished, the monster was nothing more than a bag of loose bones, and Jonathan threw it up in the air. As it came down, he drove his fist into its face, killing the creature. The monster melted away into nothing, along with its weapons. Enough essence entered him to reach the next level, and as expected, he was met with a notification. For reaching level 50, you can now upgrade your boons, or choose a new one. Available Tier 1 upgraded boons. Hardened skin. Available extra boons. Elastic muscles. Speedy nerves. Inner conscience. Jonathan could either pick to upgrade his current boon, or pick a new one. The decision was really a no-brainer, and he chose to upgrade his old one. There was no reason to branch out at this point, and he would be missing out on the bonuses from upgrading the first one. His skin started to become even harder than before, and it tightened dramatically over his bones, becoming as solid as rock. He looked down at a visible slice of flesh on his arm. It looked like it was made out of hardened leather, which was perfect for his purposes. He wouldn't be winning any modeling competitions, but he would be winning battles. Jonathan closed his interface and took one last look back at the fiery lake behind him. Then he stepped forwards and off the lava, heading for the exit. The caves continued downwards from there, with yet another borehole leading to the next stage of the dungeon. Judging by the levels of the monsters here, he was coming closer and closer to the end of the dungeon. He was a bit miffed that he had not gained any loot thus far, but he was expecting great things later on. He would gain as much as he could out of this place even if it killed him. At this rate, it might very well do so. Jonathan raced down the borehole, as there was nothing there to catch his interest save for the uniformly smooth walls. He already knew what was behind them, and he had already reaped the rewards. There would be no benefit to exposing himself to the void once more, even if the small part of him that was now dominated by the element wanted to do so, if only for the purpose of exposing the dungeon to the void. About halfway down, Jonathan noticed strange scuff marks on the floor, and as he paused, he saw that they continued all the way back up the borehole. They were barely noticeable, especially in the near darkness of the tunnel. His vision was powerful enough to see perfectly in the dark, but he couldn't create light where there was not simply by looking at it. If something was revealed by a reflection, then it was very hard to make out. Interestingly enough, the scuff marks almost matched the size of his feet exactly, almost as if he had already been down here. Jonathan knew that had not been the case, but he wasn't sure what to think about all this. It might just have been a glitch in the dungeon formation, or it could have been something more profound. In any case, it didn't affect him at the moment. As he descended further into the depths, he began to hear cheering, a sound that he most certainly had not been expecting in a place like this. He broke out into an open cavern a few minutes late, which was surrounded by tiered seating, almost like an auditorium. Bright spotlights shone down from the top, but he could not make out what they were actually made of. Humanoid monsters, that looked like bipedal bulls, were duking it out in the middle of the cavern, and the spectators, more monsters, were cheering, as if like a laugh track for a sitcom. None of them did any more than that however, and the entire thing was quite creepy. As Jonathan entered, the creature all turned towards him in unison, and began to clap again. A notification blared in front of him, and he quickly read it. You have entered a rare sub-dungeon area. This area manifests as an arena populated with monsters. The only way to escape is to defeat 10 waves of monsters, finishing with a boss-tier monster, increased because of challenger strength. Upon completion, you will be graded on your overall performance, which might lead to you being granted rewards. He had been lucky it seemed, but not in the way that he had wanted. This would slow him down by quite a bit, and it might even prove to be dangerous. However, it would be a good source of essence, and potentially rewards. Jonathan took a step forwards, and the monsters who had been fighting mere moments before charged him, howling in rage. Jonathan slid his foot back, and built up power, punching as the nearest monster reached him. His blow ripped through the monster, and he almost fell, off balance. It was far weaker than he had expected. It seemed that this arena would run the entire gamut of dungeon monster strengths. He narrowed his stance as another monster came near, and he lashed out with his gauntlet, taking its head off with one devastating blow. The audience of monsters cheered at the same volume and rhythm as before, not seeming to care much about the actual nuances of the fight itself. They were just there as some sort of narrative background noise, or perhaps even to distract Jonathan from his battle. He ignored the noises, and kept fighting, working his way through the first wave. There had been about 5 of the monsters fighting in the first round, and he finished them off in under a minute, his fists flecked with gore. The monster corpses melted away, and Jonathan barely felt the essence that entered him, as it was negligible. The audience hushed for a moment, and then a bell chimed twice, signaling the start of the second round. It didn't look like Jonathan was getting any breaks during this match, but judging by the monster's strength, he wasn't going to need any. 3 scorpions the size of horses appeared in the center of the arena, their stingers coated in viscous green poison. Jonathan fought to hide the slight sense of revulsion that entered his body upon seeing the monsters. They were misshapen on account of their unnatural size, and their flesh was warped almost across their entire bodies. They had vaguely humanoid heads too, which looked grotesque, especially considering that their scaly chitin extended onto the flesh as well. The monsters hissed at Jonathan and then scuttled forwards, their many legs leaving small divots in the sand. Jonathan coated his fists with mana, and surged forwards, diving under a lightning-fast tail swipe from one of the scorpions. They were not much faster than the previous monsters, but their stingers were considerably faster than the rest of their bodies. Jonathan reached out and grabbed the stinger in midair, and ripped it out of its socket, causing the monster to howl in pain. Green blood poured out of the stump where its stinger had been, and it whirled around towards Jonathan, its humanoid face twisted in pain and rage. It snapped at him with its claws, but it was too slow to catch him, and as the other scorpions tried to attack Jonathan, he leaped up into the air, out of their reach. The stingers whipped up after them, but Jonathan was too far away for them to affect him. As he came down, he formed orbs of his mana around his fists, empowering them beyond their normal capabilities. As he fell, he avoided the stingers, pushing off them lightly with his hand and feet. The scorpions tried to get out of the way, but they were too slow, and their bodies were too large. Jonathan fell down like a meteor, and drove his fists into their bodies. Both of the previously uninjured scorpions were still in the path of his fists, and they buckled under the force of his blow, flattening into the ground. His fists drove the void aspect mana through their bodies, eating away at them like acid. The monsters died then and there, too many of their internal organs being melted by the attack. Jonathan landed softly and turned towards the last scorpion, which was staring at him with an expression that looked almost like fear, if such a monster could feel such an emotion. Jonathan strode forwards, and sped up at the last minute, dodging between two claw swipes. With his recently enhanced resilience, it probably wouldn't have even affected him, but he still did it nonetheless. He uppercut the monster with his right fist, and as it lifted off the ground, he pummeled its softer underbelly, blasting the monster apart into chunks of flesh. He shook off his gauntlets, and waited for the next waves to come. Another notification appeared instead. You have completed the first set of waves with an overall performance score of S. This has been calculated based on the injuries that you took, the time that you spent killing the monsters, and your overall grace and technique. Well done for achieving this score, as it is quite rare indeed. The final score will be based on a weighted average of all your scores, with the final one influencing it the most. That is, if you survive. A 5-minute countdown appeared next to the notification, and Jonathan sighed as he realized that he was being forced to wait. He was ready for the next wave, and did not need any rest time. By the time that he had finished reading the message, most of his resources had been refilled, and he didn't have any injuries to attend to. As if sensing this annoyance, a set of buttons popped up beneath the timer, which asked whether he wanted to start the next wave prematurely or not. He quickly selected yes, and prepared himself for what was to come. The air started to grow noticeably warmer, and a trio of glowing worms exploded up out of the earth, each about 20 feet long. Their entire bodies were made out of a mix of glowing rock and actual lava, and they slithered across the ground towards Jonathan, hissing violently as they did so. The heat was coming off of their bodies, it seemed, but it was nothing to Jonathan, who had swum in actual lava. The three monsters opened their mouths wide and sprayed molten rock above the arena, covering a much wider area of effect that their sizes indicated. Jonathan barely got out of the way in time, but that was more out of surprise than anything else. He avoided the brunt of the lava, and ran toward the creature. Before he could reach them, however, they burrowed back into the ground, vanishing in a matter of seconds. Jonathan paused, and started to hone in his finely tuned senses, relying on his sense of touch to read the vibrations in the earth. They were faint, but they were certainly there, and he was able to get a mental map of where the monsters were under the sand. As they started to rise, Jonathan pretended to be simply confused, and waited until the last moment before he dove to the side. The creatures burst out of the ground next to him, and he whirled around, driving one ball of void aspect mana into the nearest worm. The attack found slight resistance, but still went in nonetheless, and what the mana could not do, Jonathan's strength did amply. The monster almost broke in half at the midpoint, but because of its elemental nature, there were no organs to destroy, and it was still very much alive. However, when it tried to move, its body flopped over, rendering it impotent. Jonathan danced backwards as the other worms snapped at him, sending flecks of molten spittle onto the sand where it quickly fused into glass. Jonathan gathered more mana, and ran back in, trying to finish off the gravely wounded worm that was flopping around on the ground, trying to right itself. He saw that its body was beginning to meld back together, and if that happened, all of his hard work would be undone. He did not want that to happen, so he quickly battered the monster's head into a pile of ashen rocks, which caused it to crumble away. He had no idea how exactly elementals worked, but it seemed that most creatures could be taken out with a few strong blows to the head. The other two elementals vomited up more rock, and this time, some of it landed on Jonathan's bare skin. It burnt, far more than the lava had, but it wasn't that serious of an attack. His skin bubbled underneath it, but other than the pain, there was barely any actual damage. His durability was becoming somewhat scary. Jonathan grunted in response to the attack, and pushed off the sand, racing toward his quarries. The two monsters dove back into the ground, but he seized the tail end of the nearest one, dragging it back up the surface. The sand provided poor footing for his maneuver, but the worm was not actually that strong compared to him, and he quickly pulled it out of the ground inch by inch. About halfway up, it snapped in half, and he was left holding one wriggling part of its body. Jonathan slammed the thing into the ground end over end, destroying it utterly. However, it had not been the monster's head, and the creature was still alive. As Jonathan scanned the underground with his senses once more, he detected another, larger signature, as if the two monsters had merged together. As the rumbling grew and grew, Jonathan prepared himself for what he knew was to come. A moment later, a much larger worm burst out of the ground in front of him, with its fiery skin ever brighter than before. Jonathan took a step backwards from the heat, and then was forced to leap to the side as a glob of fiery energy landed in front of him. The monster had graduated up from firing lava to firing actual balls of fire aspect mana. However, that meant that it was now vulnerable to Jonathan's unravel skill. He baited out another strike from it by standing still for the briefest of moments, and as the ball of power grew within his mouth, he sent a large portion of his immense mana pool streaking into its mouth in the form of a tendril of purple light. Rather than just explode, the attack vaporized the monster's head, using the power of the void to make the effects much more striking than normal. The monster slumped to the ground in front of Jonathan, and he watched as it melted away into the ground, its body tuning into streams of lava. With that, essence entered him, almost bringing him up by another level. The difficulty level of that fight had certainly risen from before, but it had not been especially challenging. As he readied himself for the next fight, Jonathan preemptively sent his divinity into his gauntlets, ready to activate his runes. As the shimmer of monsters appearing began to grow in the center of the arena, he triggered his skills, sending out a pulse of energy from his rune of beckoning towards the forming monsters. Even before he could tell what they were, the creatures started to run toward him, and they quickly came into focus. They looked like spiders, with humanoid features. Jonathan was quickly sensing a theme here among the monsters. They all looked like corrupted versions of humans, as if they had been long ago devolved into the hideous monsters that they were now. This fit in with the theme of the entire dungeon as well, with the idea of desolation prevalent here. The monsters were about his height and twice as long, and their bulbous, hairy legs beat up the sand as they ran towards him in a uniquely disturbing manner. Jonathan watched in disgust as they neared him, and he quickly shot out his right arm, feeling revulsion as the monster tried to grasp at him with its hairy legs. He grabbed the limb and ripped it out of the socket, pulling the monster towards him. Grabbing the limb, he whipped its previous owner with it, blasting the limb apart into chunks. The creature scurried back, allowing its partner to attack. Jonathan sent mana into both hands, and surged forwards, thrusting his hands toward the monsters. One of them rapidly spun silk into a shield that hovered in front of it, but when Jonathan's hand hit, the silk evaporated like smoke before his strike, the power of the void beating it in the end. The spider was caught in the middle of its hairy abdomen by the strike, and Jonathan ripped off a great chunk of its body, sending the monster stumbling backward, hissing in pain. He followed through with a devastating left hook that tore the monster's head off, sending its body into spasm. It gradually fell to the ground, and melted away. The other monster was right behind him at this point, and it spat a wad of webbing at him point blank, covering his left side with the sticky substance. It proved resistant to his efforts to remove it, but the spider had underestimated his strength. Jonathan reached the spider with his right hand and ripped the webbing off with ease, throwing it to the side. Rushing the monster, he sent a small amount of divinity into his right fist, and when his punch connected, the top half of the monster blasted off the rest of its body, sending a shower of gore everywhere. The monster vanished, and another notification appeared in front of Jonathan. You have completed the second set of waves with an overall performance score of S. This has been calculated based on the injuries that you took, the time that you spent killing the monsters, and your overall grace and technique. Well done for achieving this score, as it is quite rare indeed. The final score will be based on a weighted average of all your scores, with the final one influencing it the most. That is, if you survive. It was the same notification from before, just telling him that he had also completed the second wave with the best score. Well, he was assuming that S was the best score, given the way that the system was treating it. He was met with another 5-minute countdown, and he decided to wait for a few minutes before starting the next waves. His body ached from the exertion, but it was nothing that a few moments of meditation would not fix. After 2 minutes, his body had regenerated to its natural state, and he was ready to challenge the next few waves. He pressed the button, and the air shimmered in front of him, almost across half of the arena. Whatever was coming now, it was big. Shapes started to pop into existence in front of Jonathan, revealing themselves to be squat, bent-over lizard men with crude weapons. About 50 of them in all appeared in front of him, and they cackled in glee upon seeing their lone opponent. They were individually weaker than many of the previous monsters, but there were a lot more of them too. It seemed that the halfway point of this challenge was where the difficulty level rose. The monsters charged him a moment later, their legs beating up sand across the arena. They moved pitifully slowly, but there were enough of them to still render the spectacle imposing. Their movements were eerily similar, and they moved almost in lockstep, which was strange for a group of monsters. Perhaps their minds were linked in a way. As they neared Jonathan and the first row of the monster thrust out their spears in near unison, he confirmed it. They were linked at some subconscious level, and their movements were synced up to each other exactly. Still, that did not affect the speed or the power of those movements, which was all that really mattered. Jonathan snatched a spear out of the air and wrenched it out of its owner's hands, turning it around in his hand. Driving the spear forwards, he skewered a trio of lizard men on the end, before letting go of the spear. Dashing into the hole in the lines, Jonathan began to let himself loose, sending his mana and divinity into his attack. Lizards fought and died in a circle around him, none of them able to reach Jonathan before being turned into splatters of gore on the arena sands. However, there were quite a lot of them, and Jonathan was not infallible. One of them eventually managed to nick his skin with the tip of its spear, which was a lot sharper than it should have been, and poison entered his bloodstream. He immediately began to feel slightly dizzy and nauseous, but it was too weak to really affect him. However, a few moments later, another spear struck home, and the poison's effects doubled. Jonathan roared in anger and picked up his pace, butchering his irritating enemies left and right. By the time that last of the monsters had died, he had been nicked a few more times, and he was stumbling around, his motor functions somewhat diminished. As the monsters faded away however, he leveled up, which was lucky, seeing as it cleansed the poison. He could have fought with it active, but it would have been an annoyance. As the next monster appeared, Jonathan took a deep breath and sent his mana to his hand from the get-go. This time, he attacked first, racing towards the creature in front of him. As some sort of elephantine monster appeared in front of him, Jonathan leaped up, and drove his fist into the front of its skull. The creature buckled, and stumbled backwards, blood seeping down its grey skin. It looked like an elephant from Earth, but it was about twice the size, and had razor-sharp fangs instead of tusks. In addition, its face was that of a human's, just like a lot of the other monsters. All in all, it was a deeply disturbing sight. Jonathan ignored the revulsion however, and remained with his mind in the fight. As the creature's trunk swung towards him, moving like a whip, he kicked off its head and flipped backwards, landing on the ground in front of the monster. Its trunk snapped in the air like a gunshot, and the tip of it accelerated to beyond the speed of sound. For something that large to do such a thing meant that it was packing some serious force too. If that attack hit Jonathan, bones would break. It looked to be slightly dazed from the damage it had taken, but it was mostly unharmed. Its skin and bones had been thick enough to repel Jonathan's blow from earlier without much difficulty. The monster trumpeted upon seeing that Jonathan had avoided its attack, and then stamped the ground. Cracks spread out through the ground, and some sort of conceptual weight seemed to be forming around the elephant, likely related to the element of earth, if there was such a thing. Jonathan was guessing that there was. There was no other explanation for the fact that sand was staying in a cohesive shape, even though it was still, to his touch, sand. Jonathan ignored this impossibility, and focused his attention on his enemy, eyeing up the massive creature in front of him. He dodged as one of the cracks came his way, and it surged past him, splitting the arena into chunks. However, it didn't seem to do any damage, and Jonathan frowned at the elephant, which looked proud of its attack, if he was reading its expression right. Then a mighty suction erupted from the cracks and Jonathan was suddenly fighting, as if against the pull of gravity, to escape. The sand around the holes fell down into them, and the air began to boil near them. It was as if the force of gravity was being magnified at some place at the bottom of those holes, to a degree to which Jonathan could feel it. He planted his feet, and took a few steps forwards, taking himself out of the range of effect. The elephant roared and charged, its footsteps causing more cracks to form. The creature was a lot faster than its size would indicate, and it reached him deceptively quickly, with its trunk already whipping towards him. Jonathan had nowhere to run with cracks all around him, and he was instead forced to stand his ground. He braced for impact, and covered his arms in a liberal application of highly condensed mana, which created a glimmering aegis of light in front of him. It was not a proper shield, but perhaps it would suffice for now. The trunk slammed into his upraised arms and sent him flying back, his bones creaking under the strain. The trunk burnt away where it touched the mana, but it was not in contact for long enough to be much of an issue. Jonathan slammed into the bottom of the stands, cracking the rock. He groaned, and lay there for a second, dazed. As the thundering footsteps of the monster echoed around him, he forced himself up. The elephant had almost reached him by then, and narrowly avoided another blow from its trunk that fractured the rock behind where he had been lying. Jonathan scampered out of the way, and recovered as he ran, trying to get his strength back. The monster loomed over him like the behemoth that it was, and it trumped again, the noise sounding almost amused. Jonathan grunted in rage as he heard this. The brute chasing after him was amused at his suffering, was it? He would have to show it the error of its ways. Jonathan turned around as the creature barreled towards him, and packed as much of his energy into his right fist as he could. A massive ball of purple light, that quickly condensed down into a marble-sized orb, appeared in front of his glowing red fist, limned in the light of his rune of hatred. The elephantine monstrosity snorted in dismissal of the tiny technique, but Jonathan ignored it, knowing the true power of his attack. Driven by over 250 points in his strength stat, the power of the void, and the power of a nascent god, Jonathan thrust the attack directly through the monster's skin and into its skull. The bone fractured almost instantly, turning to powder as the attack reverberated throughout it. The creature's brain turned to mush a moment later, and gray matter oozed out around Jonathan's fist. A nimbus of mingled purple and red light spread outwards, vaporizing the flesh that it touched. The strike was so powerful that it blasted Jonathan himself backwards, throwing him towards the ground. The monster staggered backwards, and then fell, dissolving into specks of light. Jonathan raised his hands in victory, and shook his fists at the crowd of monsters, who were starting to go silent. It seemed that they were not happy about this turn of events. Jonathan waited the entire length of the break for the next wave to appear, and it did shortly. He was on wave 7 now, more than halfway through. What appeared next was not a monster that he recognized, however. It looked almost like a little girl, but its eyes were oddly shaped, and its face was locked into a permanent scowl. In addition, if Jonathan focused harder, he could see claws on her fingertips and the suggestion of leathery wings behind her back. In fact, it hardly looked like a girl at all. Jonathan realized that he was using divinity to see through the illusion, meaning that it was a system-granted skill that the monster was using. That meant that it was sapient. The actual monster looked nothing more than a short and squat demon, with clawed hands, a forked tail, and leathery red skin. As it realized that Jonathan had seen through its facade, the creature growled in anger, and flapped its wings, racing forwards across the sands. It couldn't really fly, but it could make itself move faster with the aid of its wings, and as it ran, Jonathan got ready. The creature could move quite fast, now that he could see it properly, and without the obfuscating influence of whatever skill it had been using, he could see clearly just how dangerous it was. The monster could move at about 3/4 of his top speed, which was quite impressive, considering the strength of the previous monsters. However, perhaps all it could do was move quickly. Jonathan grabbed the arm out of the air, but the demon whipped it back, eluding his grasp. Jonathan raised one eyebrow, and summoned his void drills to his hands, creating 2 orbs of purple light. The demon hissed upon seeing these, and Jonathan surged forwards, moving as quickly as he could. His hands tore through the air, and he drove his fist into the monster's stomach, driving it off its feet and up into the air. Flesh melted away below his strike, but not that much, considering the amount of damage that his skill should have done. The monster screeched in anger, and flapped its wings, floating off of his fists. It landed lightly about 20 feet away from him, and then burst into flames, the fire spreading across its entire form. Jonathan could feel the heat from where he was standing, and he knew that if anything, it would be able to burn him. Jonathan began to sink into his battle trance skill, and he watched as the world faded away, leaving only his opponent. He calmly analyzed the demon's fighting stance and style, and came up with a good counter for what was likely to come next. As the monster began to run, Jonathan stayed still, waiting until the last moment to strike. The monster raised its right hand once more to attack, and it came whistling towards him, looking like a line of fire in the air. Jonathan focused on the incoming attack, and parried it with his gauntlet, sending the strike skidding off to the side. The monster was briefly unbalanced by the strike, and Jonathan took that moment to attack, whipping his left fist forwards and into the demon's gut. His barbed gauntlet landed directly into the open wound of the monster, tearing it open further. The creature hissed and lashed out with its claws, drawing a line across his face. The wounds burned more than they should, and Jonathan could feel his flesh withering around the point of impact. He banished the sensation, and kept fighting, driving his fist into the monster again. The creature kept tearing at him with its curved talons, and the damage started to mount. Eventually he got it into a compromising situation, and was able to seize it by the neck. He lifted it up into the air, and snapped its neck with one mighty heave, killing the creature. He was covered in thin lines that were quickly turning black with necrosis, but the essence that entered him from the monster was enough to heal him up, with another level. If nothing else, this arena was going to boost his level by quite a lot, assuming that the monsters kept growing stronger. The only question was whether he could survive it. The next wave appeared momentarily, and Jonathan watched as a trio of strange winged creatures emerged into the air, flying towards him. They looked like raptors that were the size of men, and their feet were tipped with foot-long razor-sharp talons. Their beaks looked as if they could cut through steel, and they probably could. As they spotted Jonathan, they shrieked in unison, and dived for him, their beady eyes alight with glee. Jonathan launched himself backwards as they dove, and narrowly avoided their first strike. One of the monsters lashed out at the empty air with its talons, sending a stream of concentrated air towards Jonathan. He took the attack head-on, and was driven backwards, a bruise forming on his chest. That strike had packed quite a punch, but luckily it had been too weak to get through his armor. The monsters swooped down as he landed, and one of them swiped at him with its talons. Jonathan raised his arms to block, and felt something within them crack as the attack landed. No matter how light these monsters were, they packed quite a punch. He grabbed onto the monster as it tried to fly away, and rather than rooting it in place he was simply taken along for the ride. However, this could be used to his advantage. The cavern wall was not especially high, and there was no risk of injury if he fell. The monster could only go so high, and while he was in this situation, it would be harder for them to attack. The beast whipped at him with its other foot, trying to dislodge him. However, it was unsuccessful, and Jonathan clambered further up its body. As he reached the top, he began to pummel the creature with his fists, breaking its delicate bones in the process. The monster screeched, and the other two tried to aid it by attacking Jonathan. They were unsuccessful however, as he simply made the bird turn in the direction of every attack, forcing the other to abort it. Soon he was ready to kill the monster and he sent mana rushing to his right fist. He drove it down, and the attack blasted apart the creature's skull, killing it instantly. Before it melted away, Jonathan leaped off it and onto the nearest of the birds, repeating the same process. He was nearly thrown off by the monster as he landed, but he held on tightly, only taking a bit of damage as a talon smashed into his face in transit. Jonathan's face was slashed open to the bone, and he shouted in anger as the attack landed. He tore his way up the monster's body, quite literally in fact, tearing out chunks of its flesh as he scrambled for a better handhold. He reached the top in no time at all, and set to his bloody work, softening the monster up for an eventual kill shot. The other raptor was screeching widely, trying to aid its companion. Jonathan ignored it, and kept on pummeling, eventually breaking its neck with one of his blows. Soon there was only the final one left, and Jonathan leaped over to it. However, it had grown wise to his tricks, and it smashed him out of the air as he approached, sending him spiraling down to the ground. Jonathan impacted with a grunt, and he rolled to the side as the monster dived down, and it slammed into the sand beside him, sending up a large drift of the yellow substance. Jonathan rolled back and grabbed onto the beast, whipping it around himself and into the sand. The creature keened in pain, and Jonathan did not let it rise again, battering it into the ground with his attacks. He broke its wings first so it could not escape, and then finished it off quickly with devastating body blows and mana-enhanced strikes. As the monster faded away, he gained enough essence to almost level up. Almost, but not quite. As a result, he was left with quite a few wounds on his body, all of which stung terribly. He gritted his teeth and powered through the pain, keeping his emotions to himself. He used the entire 5 minutes to heal over his wounds, and only briefly glanced at the completion message, which told him that he had gained a rating of A for this section of the arena. It was what he had expected, given the amount of damage that he had taken. His wounds started to close over however, and by the time that the final wave began, he was mostly unhurt and he readied himself and gritted his teeth, unsure of the challenges to come. The next wave started off with a bang, quite literally in fact. The ground in the center of the arena exploded outwards, revealing a large mammalian creature that almost looked like a mole. However, it was about 20 feet long, and had what looked to be swords attached to its hands instead of claws. Well, they were that length at least. The monster set its beady eyes on Jonathan, and dove into the ground, heading straight for him. Jonathan slammed his mana down into his hands, and focused on the vibrations of the earth, plotting the path of the monster. It moved like the lava worms from earlier, but its movements were much more linear in appearance, as it could not move its body as much. However, it was far faster, and by the time that Jonathan had pinpointed its location, it was almost upon him. The monster erupted out of the ground like a furry black meteor, and clipped Jonathan with its nose, flipping him high up into the air. The creature vomited out a stream of compressed earth at him midair, slamming into his chest. A few of his ribs broke, and he was sent spiraling up even further, impacting the ceiling. Jonathan grabbed onto a nearby lip of rock, and hung there for a moment, looking down at the monster. It growled at him loudly, audible clearly even up here. Jonathan held out his right fist, and sent his divinity rushing into his gauntlet, causing it to glow with a bright red light. He then added his purple mana on top of it, creating a ball of the substance in front of his fist. With the preparations done, he let go, flipping upside down, and pushed off the ceiling. Jonathan shot down like a rocket, easily going at a few hundred miles per hour. His fist led the way, and he smashed it into the middle of the mole's back. Its flesh exploded outwards and revealed the bone underneath, which shattered beneath the force. Jonathan's right arm shattered too, but the pain and inconvenience was negligible. He pushed back off the mole's back, finding that it was still very much alive. It growled low in its throat, and began to glow with a yellow light, drawing power up from the earth around it. Rocks skittered up its side, filling in the gaping hole on its back, and rendering it able to move again. "You've got to be kidding me," Jonathan said in disbelief. He had taken quite some damage, and the mole was basically as fresh as when it had started. True, it had not actually healed itself, only rendered itself able to attack him, but it made little difference in his predicament. Jonathan shook his head, and charged, pressing his advantage as much as he could. The mole stomped the ground around it, and cracks spread outwards, merging with the ones that the elephant had left. Soon the ground around it was like a piece of broken pottery, and Jonathan's grip became far less sure. He leaped up at the edge of the fractured zone, and arced through the air, heading straight for his enemy's face. For a moment, he was wreathed in a faint glow from the spotlights, and he looked like some figure of heroism as he traveled. Then reality hit, and the mole spat a boulder into his chest, knocking him off course. Jonathan grunted as he landed, and rolled away as the mole snapped towards where he had been lying. The creature was quite annoying to deal with, and Jonathan was starting to become frustrated. It was basically just a gigantic mole, but it had so many cheat-like abilities that it almost seemed constructed to give fighters a hard time. However, he refused to lose to a creature like this. Jonathan groaned as he got to his feet, and he surged forwards, keeping to the ground this time. The mole glared down at him as he approached, and barked loudly, before sending out another stream of boulders. Jonathan weaved around it, moving quickly enough to avoid the rocks completely. He reached the side of the mole, and launched himself upwards, landing on its back. The creature started to roll over to toss him off, but Jonathan quickly made his way towards the plug of rock that was keeping the monster mobile, and began to batter it with his fists. The creature froze for the briefest of moments, and that was all the time that he needed. The rock came apart almost instantly, unable to stand up to his strength and power. Revealing the monster's spine allowed him to get some good hits in on it, completely disconnecting the vertebrae. The creature writhed beneath him, but it was unable to move, and he battered away any encroaching rocks that sought to repair the damage. He reached deep into the monster, and grabbed both ends of its vertebrae. With a mighty heave, he ripped it out on both sides, pulling the mole's skull with it. What happened next, rather than a simple and clean execution, was an explosion of gore that painted him red with a shower of blood. It was by far one of the goriest kills he had ever experienced, and he was regretting it slightly. The mole sank into the ground, never to return to plague the living again. Jonathan felt his injuries heal over with one final level up as the creature died, and he readied himself, knowing that the next fight would be the hardest yet. A roar echoed through the cavern, and heavy footsteps started to sound out from the center of the arena, as if some invisible monster was being set loose. The creature began to come into view as it walked, revealing its true form. A troglodyte, about 3 times larger than a normal one of its species, strode across the ground, dragging a massive stone sword in its right hand. It was built like a tank with thick layers of armored scales protecting every inch of its body. Two beady eyes were set deep into a prominent forehead, and they glittered with malice as Jonathan beheld them. He scanned the monster quickly to see what he was up against. Troglodyte Patriarch, Boss. Level 70. It hefted its sword, and stomped the earth once, causing it to quake beneath Jonathan. It was quite the intimidating sight. Human, the creature rumbled, its voice so low that it shook the sand around it. You attacked my people, despoiled their lands, and slaughtered them without mercy. Your bloody journey ends here and now. Jonathan grimaced. It seemed that this monster was the leader of the troglodytes, and it was pissed at him. Where were you when I did those things then? Hiding from me in terror. Jonathan replied, trying to rile the monster up. An angry opponent was always better than a calm one, unless they were far stronger than oneself. The monster roared in rage, and charged Jonathan, its footsteps shaking the ground. All of the fissures and gaps had disappeared with the death of the mole, leaving a flat playing field for the two to fight. The monster moved slowly, but it carried the momentum of a freight train, and its sword was the best possible conduit for such power. A 15-foot-long monster of a weapon, it was wrought out of black stone, and looked as if it weighed over a ton. The monster wielded it with ease however, and Jonathan did not want for that weapon to come anywhere near him. He raced forwards to meet the monster, with his fists outstretched and covered in crackling energy. The monster roared once more, and its sword started to glow with a red light, accentuating its brutalist appearance. It raised its weapon, and brought it crashing down, blasting away a 10-foot crater of sand in front of Jonathan. The sand washed over him in a wave, pushing him backwards at high speeds. He could hear the footsteps of the monster even though he could not see it, and he hurriedly extricated himself from the sand. The monster was barely 10 feet away, and it swung its sword, almost catching Jonathan. He leaped over it, but the creature reversed its grip, and swung it straight upwards, catching him on the bottom of his feet. He was sent flying up towards the ceiling, where he impacted, stunning him briefly. He fell back down to earth a moment later, and only managed to move at the last second to avoid a baseball bat swing of an attack from his enemy. The attack whistled through the air next to him, and he could feel the wind of its passing. The monster growled in rage, and let go with its left hand, reaching out to grab Jonathan out of the air. It swung him around and punted him towards the wall, trying to crush him against it. Jonathan was too strong and agile for such a thing however, and reversed himself in midair, landing with his feet first. He pushed off the wall, flying in an almost straight line back towards the monster, his fists outstretched. Twin orbs of purple light crowned his fists, and his fight fist glowed with divinity. The monster's eyes narrowed, and it swung towards him as he approached. Jonathan pulsed divinity into his left gauntlet, and the monster altered its swing by a tiny amount. It was minimal, but it was enough. The attack glanced off of Jonathan's side rather than hit him straight on, and he powered through, landing a solid hit. His fist smashed into the monster's plated abdomen, and scales flew off of it as the creature flew backwards. It had a look of complete surprise on its face at this, but it wasn't that hurt. Its stomach was vulnerable now, but it seemed to be still in the game. Its scales were immensely tough to be able to withstand a blow of that magnitude, and Jonathan began to feel a grudging respect for his enemy. He was still going to kill the monster, but it was a step above the other ones, as it was not some mindless beast hungering for blood, but a real person with its own hopes and dreams and desires. It believed that Jonathan had killed its people, and that was as good an excuse as any to fight. Jonathan knew the truth of the matter, but he didn't bother explaining himself. There was no way out of here save through bloodshed. He would spill oceans of blood over his time within the infinite hells. What more was a single drop? The answer was that it was nothing. Jonathan raced after the monster, trying to get in an attack before it recovered. The patriarch plated its reptilian feet into the sand, arresting its movements immediately. It pushed off, and rocketed towards Jonathan, using its tail to course correct. Jonathan ducked as the monster came flying towards him, and he was within its minimum weapon range. As it passed by, it whipped out with its tail, trying to knock him off balance. Jonathan grabbed the tail, grunting at the impact, and flipped the monster over his shoulder with his redirection skills. He tore something within him, but it was worth it. The creature slammed into the ground with an earth-shaking thud, and Jonathan began to wail on it with his gauntlets. The creature raised its sword to protect itself, and Jonathan withdrew quickly after realizing that his strikes were futile. The monster was covered in small wounds now, but it seemed to be more eager to fight now, rather than less. "You are good, despoiler. Your strength is far beyond what it should be. That is to be expected from one who killed my tribe. Anything less would be an insult to their memory. You talk about your tribe, but how come you were never there then? Why are you still alive to face me?" Jonathan replied. "The accursed system separated me from my tribe after we had grown to full strength, using me as a boss monster further down the dungeon. I am the only one of my people who knows of our true purpose here, as I am the only sentient one. I am the last light of the Alcazar, the original species of my tribe. When we were turned into these fleshy hulks, I managed to retain my intelligence." The monster growled low after this, and started to advance towards Jonathan. Clearly, the time for talking was over. That was fine with Jonathan. He knew that the monster was coming at him full force this time, and it had a dangerous light in its eyes that seemed to promise great bloodshed. It raised its hands above its head, with its sword between them, and started to summon a tornado of yellow energy around itself, coming up from the ground. The patriarch roared in anger, and started to channel the energy into its sword, causing a massive growth of spikes to appear on it. They were made out of solid rock, and Jonathan immediately knew what the monster was doing. It was channeling the element of earth, in a similar manner to his own void element, in order to empower its strikes. Well, two could play that game. Jonathan summoned his mana to his hands, and pushed past that, starting to draw upon the actual power of the void that lay dormant within him. It had simply tinted his mana pool before, but now the purple energy came in a flood towards his hands, turning the orbs into flecks of midnight. His eyes began to burn with a cold purple light, and he could faintly see them reflected in the metal of his gauntlets. With a grim smile, he charged to meet his enemy. The patriarch held its sword out to the side, and barreled forwards, each step shaking the ground. Jonathan on the other hand was a diminutive sight, but he contained incredible power within him, compared to his stature. A few seconds later, fist met sword in a devastating clash of power. There had been only one possible outcome to their charges, which was that they would cross weapons in the middle of their paths in an expression of dominance. Jonathan immediately started to be pushed backwards, but he gritted his teeth and poured more of his power into his first, starting to eat away at the sword in front of him. The monster's eyes widened briefly, and it started to falter as purple lines spread through its sword. Jonathan screamed and pushed his mana along the lines, cracking open the stony covering with a spray of light and jagged shards. His unravel skill had come a long way, and it was now mingled with the energy of the void. A skill notification awaited him, but he pushed it aside for now. The patriarch stumbled backwards, a crack running up and down the length of its weapon. It looked at Jonathan with a measure of fear in its eyes. "You can channel the power of the great void? What manner of monster are you?" it asked. "The one who will kill you," Jonathan replied, taking a step forward. The monster growled, and swung its weapon around, heading towards Jonathan's throat. He struck out with his gauntlet, imbuing it with the void, and slammed his fist into the middle of the crack running down the length of the sword. There was a noise like shattering glass, and the blade broke in half, falling onto the ground. The patriarch was forced to let go of the two halves, and Jonathan swooped in, driving his fists into the monster's weakened abdomen again and again. The giant creature was being forced back by the comparatively small Jonathan, and each blow tore off more flesh and spilt more blood. With bloody foam flecking its teeth, the monster roared at Jonathan, and kicked out with one of its powerful legs, trying to sweep his feet out from underneath him. Jonathan leaped backwards, and used the foot as a springboard to reach the monster's face, where he sent a piledriver of an uppercut into its jaw. The monster was lifted off its feet, and slammed to the ground, dazed. Jonathan flipped over midair, and came falling like a meteor, with his right fist limned in light. You have completed this challenge with an average rating of A. You have merited the second tier of rewards for your efforts. A series of items started to spill out of the air in the center of the arena, and Jonathan walked towards them. There were no pieces of armor, or weapons, but there were plenty of other things that could prove to be useful. A cascade of Leviathan marks fell down around the sides of the light, and Jonathan stooped down to start picking them up. Before he could waste too much time, however, a small leather pouch dropped down beside him. Jonathan looked over at the bag, perplexed, and picked it up, opening it. The inside of the bag was unusually dark, and he assumed that it was some sort of joke on the behalf of the system. In any case, it would prove useful for storing some of the coins in front of him. He began to shovel coins into the bag, quickly noticing that it didn't seem to be filling up. Frowning, he scanned the bag. Basic storage device. Tier 1 magical item. This diminutive leather pouch is not what it seems from the outside. It has been enchanted to be able to hold many times what its appearance might suggest. This particular storage device can hold up to 100 pounds of miscellaneous items, without weighing any more than its normal weight. You may check the contents of the bag by scanning it. Contents: 145 Leviathan marks. Jonathan raised an eyebrow at this, and continued to shovel coins into the bag. It seemed like this thing would prove to be useful for storing his goods in, at least. The money quickly vanished into the bottomless pit of the bag, and he scanned it once more, revealing that he possessed a bit over 500 Leviathan marks. The coins might as well have been gone, from how much their presence was noticeable to Jonathan through the bag. He clipped it to the side of his armor, and started to check out the other items around him. There were a few rings, an amulet, and even a small vial of some reddish substance that he recognized as a health potion, like the ones that he had seen within the last city. Jonathan started to scan the rings one by one, interested in how much of an effect they would have on his power. The first ring was a small band of silver, with an ornate green stone set into the center. Basic Ring of Life. Tier 1 magical item. This ring infuses the wearer with supernatural health, allowing them to take more strikes than usual. It does not provide any sort of concrete bonus, but increases the general durability of one's body. Jonathan quickly slid the ring on, and felt a pleasant sensation of warmth rush through him, seeming to energize his cells as it passed. The next ring looked a lot more sinister, and it was a band of black iron, with a ruby in it. Basic Ring of Life Steel. Tier 1 magical item. Wearing this ring allows you to siphon a small portion of the damage that you deal to enemies into your own body by using the ring as a conduit. The portion healed is minimal, but it will add up over a prolonged battle. This ring seemed to be a little less useful, depending on how much the effect actually did, but Jonathan still put it on anyway. He wasn't going to pass up on free power. After that ring, there were two more, and he analyzed them both in turn. Basic Ring of Alacrity. Tier 1 magical item. This ring imbues the wearer with preternatural speed and skill, accentuating their natural dexterity. When wearing this ring, you may be able to achieve things that are past your norm, depending on your original power. The ring seemed to be a simple multiplicative bonus to his dexterity stat, or at least to its effect on his body, which was always useful. Jonathan slid it on, and felt a small but noticeable boost to his agility. Before he could get distracted, he looked at the last ring, which was a band of iron with a yellow gemstone in the center. Basic Ring of Physicality. Tier 1 magical item. This ring increases the wearer's natural strength by a small but noticeable amount, allowing them to eke more out of their natural power than before. Jonathan smiled, and put the ring on. This would be possibly the most useful one yet. With all of the rings on, Jonathan made his way over to the amulet, which was the final item left on the ground. Basic Amulet of the Mage. Tier 1 Magical Item. You gain small bonuses to your mana manipulation abilities while wearing this ring, as well as a boost to your overall mana capacity. It was a bit annoying that the items did not give any real stat bonuses, but from what Jonathan could tell, they still had quite the effect. As he put the amulet on, the arena started to shake and it vanished without a trace, revealing a tunnel leading further into the dungeon. Jonathan started towards the exit, with all of his new rings and items on, and quite a bit richer than before. That arena had been harrowing, but it had given him quite a boost overall. Before leaving, he checked on his last notification, which was for a new skill. You have upgraded one of your skills. Unravel Epic Dash the Decaying Touch, Legendary. Your mana is anathema to all other forms of mana now, and your efforts to unravel the spells of other mages will be boosted significantly by the element of the void that is contained within your magical attacks. Few spells of your own rank will be able to resist the effects of this skill. Jonathan closed the notification, and kept walking towards the exit of the cave, ready to find out what was in store for him next. The level of the cave dropped down as he approached the tunnel and he was soon met with an imposing wall of blackness that even his advanced eyesight couldn't pierce. This tunnel was completely dark, and he had no choice but to stride into the unknown. He was confident in his abilities to defend against most things that could harm him within this dungeon, and he stepped into the darkness without a second thought. There had been one last notification, but it simply had told him that he had leveled up twice. As he walked forward, a series of sibilant whispers began to call out to him from the bottom of the tunnel, drawing him in. At least they gave him something to plot his course with. Lights flickered on and off within the tunnel, and Jonathan could tell that this was the last stretch of the dungeon. It was trying to intimidate him before he reached the boss, but he would not fall for the tricks of this place. The only true danger in here was the final boss, and nothing else was worth noticing. The tunnel kept sloping downwards, and eventually a light blossomed at the end of it, shining through the darkness. Jonathan paused before the end, and peered down into the light, trying to get a glimpse of what was there. A small cavern beckoned, with a strange hut in the center of it. All around it were hundreds of statues, each in remarkably lifelike poses. This was definitely the lair of the boss. Jonathan lowered himself down the tunnel, staying on his hands and knees so as to not alert whatever was in there to his presence. Other than the hut and the statues, the place was completely empty, and the walls were made out of a nondescript gray stone. It looked quite unassuming for the final stage of the dungeon. Hissing noises came from the center of the cavern, and Jonathan could make out a shape through one of the windows. It looked like a human, but faint shadows whirled around its head, which he assumed were snakes, like in the myths. Knowing the Greek myths, Jonathan knew that the monster would only petrify someone if it looked directly into their eyes. As long as he avoided the glare, he would be fine. Perseus had used a shield as a mirror to petrify the Gorgon, but Jonathan doubted something like that would work in this world. In the myths, the only powers that the Gorgon had were its petrification ones. Here, it had the full benefit of dozens of levels under its belt. This would not be an easy fight. Upon seeing that the monster was facing away from him, Jonathan scrambled down the last stretch of the tunnel, landing next to a statue. Half of them seemed to be various adventurers, with the others belonging to monsters, or the goblinoid creatures that had previously lived here. Jonathan used the statues as cover, and edged towards the hut, with his mana on a hair trigger to be summoned. He reached the side of the hut without any incident, and peered through one of the windows. What looked like a human woman stood in the hut, leaning over a bowl of something. She had green skin, and hair made out of snakes. In addition, her body was misshapen. It was a hideous creature, and Jonathan ducked beneath the window sill before it could turn around. He would need to come up with a plan of attack for this one. The monster seemed content to be doing whatever it was doing within the hut, which looked as if it was eating something. Jonathan started to slide towards the door, ready to enter. His idea was that he would burst in, and pinpoint the monster with his enhanced senses, closing his eyes as he attacked. However, he made sure to wait until he heard the monster go silent before attempting to do so. The creature was almost completely still in general, and Jonathan realized that he had not heard a single noise from the thing this entire time. As he edged towards the door, he flashed backwards as it swung open suddenly, revealing the side profile of the monster. It looked around suspiciously, before retreating back into its hut, to whatever it had been doing a second before. Jonathan had managed to analyze it in that brief moment, and was now a bit more knowledgeable about his opponent. Desolation Medusa. Level 75. As expected, it was about 5 levels above the maximum for this dungeon. The system had warned him about how the levels could fluctuate when it came to the boss. Seeing as the monster was not physically imposing, Jonathan assumed that it possessed great magical power, not least of which was presumably its petrification abilities. Jonathan nodded to himself, and made his way towards the door, ready to attack. "You adventurers are all the same," a low and feminine voice said, coming from inside the hut. "Always assuming that I am nothing more than a monster. See how that turned out for them." It looked like the monster had already sensed his presence. Jonathan remained stalwart however, and stayed silent. "I can hear your heartbeat. There is no hiding from me. If that is so, then why don't you come and fight me?" Jonathan replied. There was a chance that the monster was simply trying to get inside his head. The creature laughed, sounding disturbingly like a normal human woman in the process. "Silly boy. You will come to me, will you not? You need to claim my head to escape this place. Why should I bother myself in chasing after prey that is all too willing to deliver itself into my jaws? So you plan to eat me? What about the people that you turned into statues?" Jonathan was wasting time with this banter, but he was intrigued about the insights that the monster had. "You seem different from the normal adventures. Usually they come in groups of 4 or 5, and are not worth my appetite. However, you give off an aura of refined power that is rare. Your meat will be especially sweet." The creature's voice sunk at the end of that declaration, revealing it for what it truly was. A monster. Jonathan sensed that this conversation had come to a finish, and he drew back his fist, ready to break down the door. He drove it forwards, and splintered the wood with a single punch, revealing the inside of the hut. He shut his eyes immediately, and was able to pinpoint the position of the Medusa without his sight. "You are a fool. You merely blinded yourself. The others were at least more resourceful." Jonathan managed to conceal a smile. The monster had no idea that he had passed all of his thresholds, and possessed the superior senses of an advanced human. He decided to play into the ruse a bit more, and suddenly snapped out a punch at the open air in front of him, stumbling at the end so as to make it seem like he had been aiming for the monster. There was a girlish laugh, and the air stirred to the right of his head. Jonathan remained still for as long as he could, and then he shot out his hand, grabbing something long and scaly in it. With a grunt, he pulled, tearing the snake out of the creature's head. He could feel a tiny amount of power enter him, and reinforce his body. That was the effect of his new ring, it seemed. With a quick step, he drove his fist into the Medusa's face, sending it flying backwards, crashing through the walls of the hut. Jonathan resisted the temptation to open his eyes, and he followed the disturbed air towards the hole in the wall, getting ready to strike once more. The monster rose to its feet, and hissed at Jonathan. He could not see its face, but he could tell that it was furious. No more words were spoken, and it seemed as if the monster had simply devolved into animalistic rage. That suited him just fine in any case. Jonathan walked forwards, keeping a supercilious grin on his features. He knew that he was better than the Medusa, deprived of all its tricks, and it knew it as well. The monster would have been an almost impossible challenge without his enhanced senses, but he was apparently a natural counter to its abilities. However, he remained wary. He had already theorized about the presence of other abilities within the monster's roster of power. One of those abilities suddenly came to the fore now, and he heard a ripping noise coming from the direction of the Medusa. Straining his perception to the utmost, he got a vague picture of the creature expanding in size, growing until it was almost double his height. No longer was it a small, almost petite creature. Now it was a true monster. Jonathan ducked to the side as he heard a punch come whistling in, and he realized that his senses were even more developed than he had expected. He could sense things almost as well as if his eyes were open, even with them shut. It was like there was a field of perception around himself that he could use to fight with. It only extended out for about 10 feet, but it was interesting to discover anyway. The monster roared in anger and swiped out with its hand once more, trying to catch him. Jonathan narrowed his eyes, in order to focus more effectively, and tried to pinpoint the position of the creature's hand. He lashed out, and brushed against the flesh, almost catching onto it. However, he was a bit too imprecise, and the monster managed to slam its hand into the side of his face, sending him rolling across the ground. It had hit with immense force, but Jonathan was surprisingly alright, the benefit of his extended multiplier from his titles. He got to his feet slowly, and heard another whistle of air coming from his front, signaling something that seemed to be a flying kick. Jonathan pushed off the ground and landed 10 feet away, hearing something crash into the stone, cracking it. He got to his feet and rushed forwards, punching towards where he had heard the sound last. The monster was fast, but its body was quite large, and Jonathan managed to land a hit, sinking his fist into flesh. He pulsed his mana out through his fist as he did so, atomizing a small section of the creature, flesh. The monster roared and reached out with its massive hand, grabbing him by the throat. Jonathan struggled, managing to pry the monster's fingers loose with his immense strength. As he dropped down to the ground, however, a fist caught him in his stomach, driving the air out of him and rupturing something within his abdomen. Jonathan spat up blood as he flew, landing in the middle of the cottage's wreckage. He spat out more blood as he rose, a bit disorientated. The monster charged him, its footsteps echoing across the ground as it ran. It did not seem to care for stealth, now that it had tasted blood. He might have been able to fight against the monster somewhat with his enhanced senses, but he was unable to use his more developed martial skill, which needed him to be able to see. Jonathan waited until he could hear the monster coming near, and then jumped straight up, avoiding a strike from below. He came down with his fist at the ready, coated in void aspect mana. The purple attack slammed into the monster's face, and knocked it to the ground, drawing blood. The creature hissed, and Jonathan felt something latch onto his arm, biting into it. His arm started to go numb from the attack, and he realized that he had just been bitten by a snake. He groaned, and withdrew, holding his arm, which was starting to become unresponsive. The Medusa laughed at him, and padded forwards, trying to come bare enough to strike. Jonathan closed his eyes, and began to focus on his mana pool within him, seeing an orb of purplish light within the center of his chest. He took a tendril out of it, and then thrust it into his arm. A terrible burning sensation spread throughout the limb, and Jonathan screamed. Steam rose up from the air, carrying away the poison with it. The mana was quite literally burning it out of his body. His numbness stopped spreading, and then left, leaving him in full command. Jonathan stepped forward, and raced toward the site where he had last heard the monster, driving his fist outwards as he did so. It seemed that the monster had been shocked at this recovery, as the strike hit home. Jonathan felt blood spurt up beneath his fist, and he smiled grimly, sending his energy out through his fist, and evaporating the flesh. The monster screamed in pain, and Jonathan struck again and again, pulping its flesh. Flesh exploded under the force of his power, and the Medusa shot backwards, slamming into the far wall a few hundred feet away. Jonathan pulled back his fist, and waited for the monster to make its move, unable to detect it from this far away. The creature screeched in pain, and it seemed to be on its last legs from what Jonathan could hear. It came charging towards him regardless, much slower than it had previously done. It was seriously injured at this point, and Jonathan was comparatively unscathed. Sure, he had some injuries, but he could mitigate their effect. He waited for the creature to come to him, and when he heard its labored pants in front of him, he struck out. The monster tried to dodge, but it was too inhibited by its injuries, and Jonathan's strike hit home, breaking the creature's left arm. It roared at him, and a sudden light burned through his eyelids, forcing him to look at the world in front of him. The Medusa had one hand outstretched, with a faint glow quickly fading around it. The monster was in terrible shape, but there was a grim smile on its face. Jonathan tried to move, but he realized that his legs were completely unresponsive. Looking down, he saw that they were slowly turning to gray stone. He tried to move, but he was unable to, and all that happened was that he fell over. The Medusa shifted back into its normal form, and laughed. "Part of your body will be ruined by this, but I will still savor the taste of your flesh," it said, as it bent over to bite him. Jonathan had other plans though. He pulsed his divinity through his body, burning away the stone with an application of his smite skill. Jonathan slowly rose, his body burning with divine light. As he did so, the Medusa took a step backwards, and in Jonathan's eyes, it saw its own death. He could feel its power trying to take a hold of him, and petrify his body, but it could gain no purchase on his ironclad defenses. Jonathan rushed forwards, so fast that it almost seemed like teleportation, and smashed his right hands into the Medusa's face. Bones shattered and its brain burst beneath his strike, causing the monster's head to explode. Essence entered him, and he gritted his teeth, using the healing to ride out the damage from his use of his smite skill. He had leveled up twice from that kill, which was a bit less than he had been expecting. It seemed like he was starting to be able to deal with the damage better than before. Jonathan took a few deep breaths, and then was suddenly caught off guard by a drilling punch that caught him in the back. He was driven off his feet and face planted, hard. Jonathan rolled forwards, and got to his feet, turning around to see his assailant. To his surprise, it was him. A figure dressed in the same suit of armor as him, and with the same weapons, stood there, grinning at him. "Hello, Jonathan, or should I say, me?" the clone said, taking a few steps forward. "Who the hell are you?" Jonathan asked the creature, getting ready to fight. Whatever this thing was, it was clearly hostile. "I am the dark copy of you that was created at the very beginning of this dungeon. If I defeat you, I will get to claim your life as my own. What better type of desolation than that at your own hands?" It was clearly a rhetorical question as the clone sprang forward, and punched towards Jonathan, its fists glowing with blue light. Jonathan got ready to block, and then paused, taking in the sight. Whatever this thing was, it did not possess any of his unique abilities or traits. It still had his skills and presumably his stats, but this fight would be a lot easier than he had expected. Jonathan squared his stance and then lashed out with his fists, trying to catch his opponent off guard. However, the doppelganger had the same martial abilities as him, and it avoided the attack, continuing its trajectory. Its fist slammed into his stomach, folding him over. He coughed up blood and then retaliated, his fist glowing with the power of the void. He landed a hit in the same spot, but this one tore straight through the chainmail armor and into the clone's stomach. A look of profound confusion entered its features as it stumbled backwards, and Jonathan did not let it get back in control. He stepped up, and drove a devastating right hook into the creature's jaw, knocking it to the side. It possessed his immense durability, as the strike did not instantly kill it, but he dislocated its jaw. Jonathan whipped up his left fist, and shattered the jaw entirely, dazing the clone. He wailed on his dark mirror image, and gritted his teeth, focusing on making sure that it did not recover. Some time later, he found that he had retreated into his battle trance, and that the battle had already finished, with his clone lying on the floor in front of him in a bloody heap. As he beheld his work, the dungeon started to fade away. The world around him started to swirl, and he was transported to a nondescript room, filled with seemingly random items. A large notification hovered in front of him, informing him that he could pick 3 of the items that he saw in front of himself. The room was divided into 3 parts. The one closest to him contained a multitude of weapons, all of which looked quite powerful. Massive swords sat by gleaming bows that seemed to be wrought out of the most exotic materials that Jonathan had ever seen. On the next ring, there were all manner of suits of armor, from the commonplace to the absurd. Jonathan saw one in particular that caught his eyes. It looked exactly like the sort of armor that the Hellbreaker should have. It was a matte black suit of plate metal armor that looked to be built for durability. It was a bit on the worn side, compared to the sparkling armor around it, but it caught his eye regardless. Without a moment's hesitation, he knew that this was the suit of armor for him. Firstly, however, he wanted to see if there were any weapons that were worth taking. The entire room was about 100 feet wide, and the section with the weapons in it took about a quarter of the area, in order to make up for the space that the armor took up. The closest weapon to Jonathan was a pair of short swords. They sat on a small platform that was made out of some dark metal. The weapons themselves were made out of silvery steel, with a few dark accents along the blade. He wasn't interested in using them, but he did scan them to see how good the quality of the rewards from this dungeon was. Nightblade Twins Words. Tier 1 Growth Weapon, Bladed. Twin blades wielded by assassins, these swords are perfect for any dastardly deeds best carried out in the dead of night. Small, unassuming, and incredibly sharp, there are few things within the realm of Tier 1 power that these weapons cannot damage. These swords have the ability to grow with the user, up to a maximum of Tier 2. Upgrade Reagents, Tier 2 Monster Blood, Tier 2 Steel. Plus 12 to Dexterity while wielding. Jonathan raised one eyebrow, surprised by the additional section of the interface. This was the first time that he had heard anything about growth weapons. The weapon itself was about as good as his gauntlets, with a 12-point stat bonus, but that would presumably increase as the weapon grew in power. Still, he preferred his gauntlets for now, at least until he could find an upgrade. Jonathan put the weapons back, and searched around the rest of the area for something that he could use instead of his gauntlets. However, there did not seem to be anything there as far as he could tell that would be a perfect replacement. There were a few knuckle dusters and similar weapons, but nothing like his own ones, which towed the line between weapon and armor. Just as he was about to give up, however, he spotted a glowing chunk of blue rock that seemed to exude an aura of concentrated power. He edged over to it, not sure what exactly he was looking at. It was in the weapons section, which meant that it was powerful, but it clearly was not any sort of weapon. Jonathan picked it up and scanned it a moment later. Soul Core, Weapon. Tier 1 Upgrade Orb. This orb can be used to infuse any Tier 1 weapon with the ability to grow in power, up to a maximum of Tier 2. It can only be used once, after which it will be destroyed. It seemed to be exactly what Jonathan had been looking for, and it looked as if the system had thought this section of the dungeon out well. If someone had an exotic weapon that they could not find a replacement for here, they could simply use this to boost their original one. Jonathan took the orb in both hands, and felt it start to shake. A notification popped up, asking him if he wanted to use it. He hit yes, and watched as the stone split off into streamers of blue light that sank into the gauntlets. The weapons glowed briefly, and then went back to their normal color. They did not feel any different physically, but they had a greater weight to them now than before, a spiritual weight. Jonathan smiled, and made his way towards the next section of the room. It was time to check out the suit of armor that had caught his eye earlier. He made his way into the rows of armor racks that took up the next section of the room, and soon found himself standing in front of the black suit of plate armor. None of the other suits of armor had caught his eye on the way there, and he was content to look at this one first. Even if it was bad, he could simply look at the other ones then after. Jonathan scanned the armor, eager to see just exactly what he was dealing with here. Hell Knight Plate. Tier 1 Growth Armor, Heavy. This suit of armor, while battered, is one of the best of its kind that you will find within this circle of the infinite hells. Made for a servant of Granath long ago, this suit has since been lost, only to be reconstituted by the system as a reward for the most daring of dungeon delvers. You have caught the attention of the system with your prowess, which has resulted in you earning this armor. This suit has the ability to grow with the user, up to a maximum of Tier 3. Growth reagents, Tier 2 bone, Tier 2 blood, Tier 2 dark iron. Plus 12 to resilience, plus 12 to constitution, minus 6 to dexterity while wearing. The armor was exactly what he was looking for. It had an unfortunate demerit to dexterity, but it was minimal compared to the rest of his stats. The boost that it gave overall was greater than any piece of equipment that Jonathan had possessed before. In addition, it had an even higher growth potential than the other items in here. Jonathan took off his chainmail armor, and put on the new suit, watching as it tightened to fit his body. The suit was quite heavy, much heavier than any normal person could hope to wear, but to Jonathan it merely felt like he was wearing a few layers of clothes. The dexterity penalty was likely from the fact that moving while in it was a bit clumsier than normal given that it was quite thick, rather than from the weight. Jonathan put his old suit of armor into his storage device, marveling at how it just vanished into there, despite being many times larger than the pouch. Jonathan left the suits of armor behind, and moved on to the final part of the rewards room, where a random assortment of items were displayed. It was filled with all sorts of things, from rings to brooches, to even more storage devices. This was a section where one could find almost anything, and there were easily thousands of items on display here. Jonathan started to walk around the circle, inspecting everything that he could set his eyes on. The overall quality of work here was a bit worse than with the armor and the weapons, but it was still some good stuff overall. Many of the rings gave stat bonuses, as opposed to the ones that he had received earlier in the dungeon. Eventually, he decided to go with a small band of silver that gave a 12-point boost to dexterity, which would cancel out the effects of his armor, and give him a boost as well. Sliding the ring on, Jonathan watched as the room began to shake, and soon it vanished before his eyes. Jonathan blinked once, and found himself standing outside of the cave, back in the ash heaps. He quickly climbed up the side of the cave entrance, wanting to get a look at something other than gray rock for once. The heat of the land was the first thing that he noticed, quite different from the coolness of the caves. The second thing that he noticed was the large army surrounding the dungeon, with all of their weapons pointed towards him. There were what looked like hundreds of grim-faced men and women facing him, all of whom were seemingly ready to fight at a moment's notice. Their ranks were uniformly spaced, in a way that allowed them to surround the entire dungeon entrance with their numbers. They all wielded a mix of various melee weapons, and strangely enough, there did not seem to be any mages or even ranged fighters. It seemed like they had made some assumptions about Jonathan's fighting style, based on his magical unbinding skill, and his durability. Most ranged weapons at this level would be useless against him, unless they were overwhelmingly powerful. They were staring directly at him, and Jonathan regarded them with a stony glare, wondering if they were actually there for him or not, given that none of them had moved a muscle. Jonathan moved to the side, and when their eyes followed him, he realized that he had been spotted. A heavily armored figure stepped forward from amid the ranks, his strides shaking the ground. The man's size and the form of his armor marked him to clearly be such. He was dressed in a suit of red and black plate armor, and seemed to be a similar fighter to Jonathan. His fists were covered in giant metal gauntlets that were designed for brutal crushing attacks, rather than the quick and efficient punches of Jonathan's gauntlets. They were covered in banded metal, and were a lot more unwieldy than his own weapons. However, the gauntlets looked just as deadly. In addition, a concentrated aura of power surrounded the man, promising bloodshed. "Jonathan Harlow," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I am Downer, 95th Captain of the Legions of Granath. You have been found in violation of the laws of this land, and your punishment is death." Jonathan did not respond, instead looking for a way out. He quickly scanned the army, his eyes glossing over the individuals. His heart sank as he saw their levels. All of them were at least level 50, and the leader himself was level 75. Individually, they were not too much of a threat, and the captain was the only one of concern, but together, Jonathan did not have a chance in hell of winning, which was apt, considering his situation. However, there was something that was bothering him, something that did not make sense. He had clearly become enough of a nuisance to the forces of Granath to be known to them by name, yet they did not simply send some tier 2 after him to deal with him. That did not make sense, unless... So that's why I haven't died yet, Jonathan said. Something is preventing Granath from sending his strongest fighters after me. Jonathan smirked beneath his helm. And, given the way that the hells are set up, it must be because of my power. He can send as many fighters of my level as he wants, but he cannot simply send someone who will obliterate me outright, isn't that right? You misbegotten fool, Downer blustered, his voice a bit on edge. You know nothing about the workings of the hells. Jonathan smiled. He had gotten all the confirmation that he needed. He knew a bit more about the world around him now. He would use that information to great effect later on. As he faced off against the enemy army, he received a notification from the system. You have discovered a universal law, keyed to the infinite hells. The law of honest battle. Any circle lord, or their immediate subordinates, cannot use their power to directly assault any being that is less than 3 times weaker than them, with the exception of assault onto their personages, or on their direct possessions. However, if this restriction is broken, it is broken permanently. This is to prevent the complete hegemony of circle lords over their circles, and to preserve the sanctity of the universal struggle. There was a lot of unfamiliar nomenclature in there, but it seemed to make sense to Jonathan. As far as he could tell, this was not done out of the goodness of the system's heart, but in order to preserve its juicy share of the essence stock available within its purview. Seeing as the hells contained a large portion of all of this universe's dead, that was a lot of essence being earned by people fighting within it. An amount of essence that was apparently too precious for the system to lose out on. Because of the fact that killing someone much weaker than you granted almost no essence, the system was losing out. However, it only applied to the circle lords, and anything else was fair game. Jonathan closed the notification, noting that the enemy had not taken a single step forward. Jonathan strode towards the edge of the cliff, and jumped down, landing on the ground with a loud thump. He eyed up the enemy leader, and spoke. I have a proposal for you. I challenge you to a duel here and now, with the stakes being my life. If I win, then your army will retreat. If you win, well, I'll be dead. No, the enemy captain replied, before signaling for his men to attack. Jonathan sighed. It had been worth a try. Noticing that the enemies were starting to close in on his position, breaking off from their carefully arrayed ranks, Jonathan quickly made a decision. He immediately started running towards a weak spot in the enemy ranks, spotting an opportunity for escape. He could have fallen for the trap and ran the opposite way, but he knew that there were blind spots where the enemy leader could have positioned troops to surprise him if he tried to do so. Besides, he was eager to test his newfound power against something other than beasts. He had no wish to fight here and die, and he would prioritize his survival, but he knew that he was strong enough to get away if he did this right. However, Downer had other plans. The man reached out towards Jonathan, and a tendril of reddish energy whipped out of his hand, snapping towards Jonathan's feet. It looked like a mana construct, and Jonathan recognized it as being imbued with some sort of elemental affinity, as his own one responded to it. It tripped him up before he could react fully, however, moving so fast that it was almost a blur. It seemed that Downer had some tricks of his own. The tendril closed around his feet, preventing him from rising. Downer strode towards him, the man trying to get to Jonathan before he escaped. Dark lightning crackled around his massive gauntlets, promising violence if he reached Jonathan. Jonathan slammed his mana down into the tendril binding his feet, causing it to crack apart with small lines of purple energy running through it. He tore his feet free, breaking apart the fraying red energy. He got to his feet and kept running, building up speed and power for his initial impact with the enemy lines. At this rate, he would reach them before they reached him. He hit the soldiers a few seconds later, and he bowled through them, his superior physical strength enough to overpower the first rank, breaking bones and stunning the soldiers nearest to him. However, they piled up behind each other, supporting each other with their hands and weapons, and managed to stop his assault. Jonathan pushed as hard as he could, finding that they were too tightly braced, and then jumped backwards, watching as the soldiers stumbled. He would hazard a guess that they had never had to deal with someone as powerful as him in open combat. He then leaped over their heads, avoiding another attack from Downer. The whip of red light instead snatched up one of the soldiers, whipping them backwards across the heads of their fellows. Downer didn't seem to care, instead snapping his wrist, and sending the soldier flying off towards the dungeon. Jonathan kept running as he landed, amid a group of fighters. They were all clad in silvery armor, with a few black accents, but he fancied that he could see them paling in terror as he began to attack. Jonathan summoned his void drills to his hands, creating orbs of dark purple light around them. With a deep breath, he began to attack. He punched multiple times every second, creating afterimages of his fists as he did so. The soldiers that he struck head-on turned into showers of watery gore, and even the strikes that did not hit ended up taking off limbs. Jonathan did not pay attention to the individual soldiers as he fought, simply thinking about punching and kicking. He had to dodge a bit as well, as the enemies, while much weaker than him, were still relatively high-leveled. The one good thing about being buried in the middle of this morass was that Downer was having a hard time getting to him. The enemy soldiers were starting to break before the indomitable will of his attacks, and Jonathan was starting to break through to the other side. Now their strategy of bunching together was working against them, as even though they would be able to repel a charge, the soldiers at the front of the lines were now vulnerable to melee combat. If he managed to escape, then there would be no stopping him. If they had sent a few people of Downer's caliber, then this might have gone differently, but as it was, he was actually benefiting from the high numbers of relatively weak foes. Essence was entering him in a constant stream, that, while lacking much depth, still ended up making a difference in the grand scheme of things. If he killed every last one of these soldiers, then he probably would have gained a level. However, he was not planning to do so. His new armor was being tested greatly in this fight, and it seemed to be doing an excellent job of turning attacks away with its thick plate armor. Jonathan was glad that he had picked this suit over all else, and it was certainly holding up well to all assault. As Jonathan slowly but surely forced his way towards the back of the enemy army, Downer was desperately trying to get to him. The captain had not been in a serious fight in his entire time in the legions of Granath, as few people ever dared to assault a member of the army. The forces of the circle were more for show than anything else, and while they contained quite a few high-leveled people, they lacked any sort of real-world experience. Such were the benefits, and the downsides of their positions. Sure, they trained extensively with each other, in the ways of war and their martial paths, but the fact was, Jonathan was a battle-hardened veteran, and they were not. Downer had only ever killed those far weaker than himself, and now that he was coming up against someone who could actually put up a fight, his resolve was crumbling somewhat. Jonathan was proving to be far stronger than even the most exaggerated of reports had indicated, and Downer wasn't sure what to do. He was ineffectively trying to get through the ranks of his men, but he wasn't sure what would happen even if he managed to reach his target. He had never been in a true life-or-death battle before, and he was sure that if he engaged Jonathan in a proper duel, then he could just as easily die as defeat the other man. Those were unacceptable odds to Downer. Instead, he tried to target the man from afar, sending his whip-like strikes over the heads of his fellows. They were proving to be quite useless, however. Jonathan ignored the attacks coming in from behind, and used the soldiers around himself as a shield to deter Downer's frequent attacks. The spell that he was using seemed to have a degree of autonomy, and once it latched onto a target, then it pulled them back towards the caster, no matter if they wanted that or not. Because of this, Downer was wasting valuable time as he tried to get to his quarry. Jonathan ducked under a strike from a sword-wielding soldiers, and used his fist to redirect the strike into another one of his enemies, breaking through their armor with the force that he imbued into the strike. At least his martial skills were getting a good workout here. He had discovered that his redirection skill could be applied to almost anything with movement, and that it worked on the attacks of his enemies as well, as long as he got to it first. He sensed that he was starting to come closer to an upgrade for the skill, but he would need to refine it a bit more first. He would use these soldiers to do so. It was easy enough to deal with them, as they all seemed to be mirrors of themselves, trained from the same master most likely. There were only a few weapons that Jonathan could see being used, and out of them, the sword was by far the most common. It wasn't that they were bad, per se, but they lacked any sort of drive past the mastery of their own techniques. They weren't like Jonathan, who had dealt with danger since entering this world. Likely, none of them had ever been in a situation where they had to fight for their lives on their own. They probably had lived quite a sheltered life, or as sheltered a life as one could within the infinite hells. It wasn't like there were any frequent uprisings around here anyway. Jonathan was giving them a good workout. He weaved around their strikes like they were from the most unskilled of children, and used his fists to teach his foes a permanent lesson. He tried to limit his reliance on his overabundance of stat points halfway into the fight, wanting to train up his martial power. Having his stats, he felt an immense difference from the get-go, and the attacks from the soldiers were suddenly a lot more pressing. His armor was still just as durable however, which he was counting on. Jonathan knew that he was dancing on the knife's edge here, but he knew that this would be a good opportunity to rank up a few of his skills. As he looked at the soldiers rushing towards him, faster than they had a few seconds before, he raised his fists, and began to move. His first attack redirected the sword strike of his closest assailant, and he grabbed the weapon by the blade, slapping it upwards. The soldier was disarmed by the attack, and Jonathan reached out, grabbing the weapon out of the air. He swung it around, and cut straight through the soldier's neck, bending this armor in the process. As the body fell, Jonathan threw aside the sword, and ducked under an axe, kicking out into the knee of the soldiers who had sent it his way. The joint buckled backwards, and the man stumbled, allowing Jonathan to drive a devastating uppercut into his jaw. Blood flew in an arc as he landed his attack, and the man landed 10 feet away in the midst of his companions. Even though Jonathan was limiting his power somewhat, he was still stronger than any of these people here. The only danger to him was in their sheer weight of numbers. However, if it became too dangerous, he would revert back to his normal state. As he progressed, the soldiers began to adapt to his movements, starting to position themselves in a way that allowed for them to attack him while being protected by their fellows. Even if they were not exactly the best of fighters, they were still well trained as it was, and Jonathan sensed that the time for experimentation was over. He quickly went back to his normal rate, and powered through the nearby soldiers, pushing them away with his strength. His feet dug deep into the ground as he moved, and he eventually forced enough of the soldiers out of the way to break through to the other side. He did not look back once, and instead started to run at his full speed, racing across the ash as he did so. Behind him, the soldiers turned around, and ran in pursuit, but it was pointless. They had made a grave error in the army composition that had been sent after Jonathan. If they had possessed a few ranged fighters, then the outcome might have been quite different. However, they likely had been afraid of his unravel skill being the bane of any mage that attacked him, and as a result the only person with ranged attacks that they had sent was Downer. In addition, they likely had not expected the difference in power between him entering the dungeon, and him exiting it. He had grown in more than just levels within that place, and his newfound connection to his divinity had empowered him more than should have been possible. Jonathan was a bit annoyed that he hadn't been able to fight Downer, but he knew that if he had stayed, he would have died. He had managed to deal with the soldiers around him, but his stamina would have eventually run out, leaving him defenseless. In addition, by the time that he had left, the soldiers were becoming too much of a threat to him as they adapted to his fighting style. Half of his success had been due to shock at his power, rather than his actual prowess itself. Jonathan was strong, but he would not have survived that battle had he not been able to escape. Jonathan spared a glance backwards, and saw a figure wreathed in red light racing across the ash, faster than even he was moving. It seemed as if Downer was stepping up his game. The man shot off a blast of red energy towards Jonathan, almost hitting him with the end. It seemed that he focused more on the speed of his spells than anything else. Jonathan ignored the obvious attempt at a provocation, and kept running. If he was to fight Downer, he would do it out of range of the rest of his army. Jonathan headed towards a nearby ruin, which seemed like the perfect place to get a vantage point on the nearby land. He doubted that these were the only forces sent to capture or kill him, and he knew that there were likely more in the surrounding lands anyway, even if they were not there for him. Jonathan made a beeline for the crumbling spire of rock and wood, and looked back to see Downer changing course to follow him. The other man was about a mile behind him, but he was slowly gaining on Jonathan, as his longer legs were propelling him faster. Despite his heavy armor and seemingly defense-oriented build, Downer was quite fast, which seemed to come into play with his spellcraft as well. Jonathan guessed that the man had invested heavily into dexterity and his mental stats with a bit added to his other physical ones to complete the build. He was actually similar to Jonathan in a way, just less overpowered. Jonathan kept running, even as he thought about what this meant for the probable fight between the two of them. Downer's signature move was the whip attack, which Jonathan would have to watch out for. It did not deal any damage, but it would be deadly in a fight, where a moment of weakness could spell the difference between victory and defeat. A few minutes later, Jonathan had reached the tower and was racing up its stone step towards the top. Downer was following along behind him, which was good. He could use this tower to get a bit of ground on the other man. Jonathan reached the top mere second later, and looked out across the endless ash fields in front of him. There were what looked to be watchtowers scattered around the area, with one every few dozen miles. In addition, regular patrols of soldiers marched between them in what looked to be some sort of order. Jonathan had not spotted any of these forces on the way in, but he realized that they were all on one side of the tower, the one that was facing the center of the ash heaps. The land around the capital probably became more densely populated and as a result, more heavily defended, the closer that one got to Granath's seat of power. With this in mind, Jonathan leaped off the side of the tower, and started to run in the opposite direction from the towers. Downer roared in anger behind him, infuriated at the fact that Jonathan simply kept running rather than staying to fight. Jonathan grinned. The other man would be getting the fight that he wanted soon enough. By this point, the rest of the army sent to fight him, if it could really be called an army, was so far behind that Jonathan could have slowed to a walking pace, and they still would have taken a while to reach him. There was a clear divide between fighters and elites within this world, and although the soldiers were quite powerful in their own right, and highly leveled, they could not stand up to someone like Jonathan. The ash kicked up beneath his feet, leaving a faint trail of black behind him as he ran. He reveled in his speed, putting it fully to the test. He was moving at hundreds of miles per hour, and although his stamina bar was dropping quite quickly, he kept at that speed for a few seconds, trying to get a feel for his new parameters after coming out of the dungeon. He hadn't been able to test them properly within the dungeon, as there was not adequate space to do something like run. However, he had plenty of space now. He had almost doubled in power during that dungeon run, counting the increases to his skills as well as to his stats. That was a most impressive achievement, and it meant that he had been justified in his choice to head towards the dungeon. Some time later, Jonathan looked back, and saw that Downer was lagging behind, his stamina having given out somewhat. Now that the man had been softened up, it was the perfect time to strike. Jonathan had been intending to fight him all along, but in a field of battle where the odds favored him. He wheeled around, and headed back towards the man, starting to channel his mana as he did so. The purple light blossomed on the ends of his fists, and he reached Downer a few moments later, fresh and ready for a battle. Downer seemed to be quite exhausted from his chase, and when he spotted Jonathan coming in, he stopped, and raised his fists, ready for a fight. Jonathan did not slow down as he approached, and as Downer snapped his wrist, projecting out a tendril of red light towards Jonathan's legs, he sent out his awareness towards the attack, managing to get a hold of it. He sent his mana into the tendril a moment later, and it snapped apart midair, falling into a multitude of fragments. By that point, Downer lacked the time to form another one, and Jonathan was upon him. His right fist came in like a bullet, and Downer only managed to cross his arms in time to block the attack. Jonathan dove his weight and strength into the blow, and knocked Downer backwards, sending the other man off his feet. Downer rolled on the ground, getting to his feet an instant later. He might have been lacking a bit in strength, but he certainly was fast. In fact, without his armor, he might have been faster than Jonathan. Jonathan circled around the other man, watching out for an opening. Downer grunted, and summoned lightning to his hands, causing his gauntlets to crackle with black energy. He roared, and slammed his fists together, sending a bolt of electricity streaking straight for Jonathan. Jonathan could not dodge in time, or unbind the spell, so he instead crossed his arms in front of himself, and summoned his mana to his arms, focusing on empowering the void aspect within it. The lightning hit a millisecond later, and Jonathan screamed as his body withered under the strike. The mana coating his arms wicked away some of the lightning, destroying it, but a lot of it made its way through, and started to drain Jonathan's health bar. He gritted his teeth, and took a step forwards, focusing on his opponent. Downer snorted, and slammed his fists together again, redoubling his efforts. Jonathan was almost blasted off his feet, but he instead harnessed more of his mana, sending it back through the stream of lightning connecting himself with Downer. The lightning bolt started to come apart, veins of purple light running up and down its length. Downer tried to cancel the skill, but it exploded, driving Downer's hands apart and blasting him off his feet. As the man got up, he surreptitiously edged backwards. Jonathan knew exactly what he was doing though, and he saw that the man was trying to lead him back towards his supporting forces, who were starting to near their position. Instead of continuing the fight, as he wanted to, Jonathan instead took off once more. He wouldn't let his ego bait him into a trap like this. He did not need to defeat Downer, only to escape. Downer stared at Jonathan's back, and clenched his fists so hard that blood ran down his hands. He was being actively mocked by his quarry, and his sense of pride could not stand for that. He sighed, and reached down to his belt, taking out a strange orb that looked to be composed of pure fire, condensed down to the size of a marble. It was a special gift from Granath himself, to be used if Jonathan escaped him. Bracing himself for the pain to come, Downer threw the orb after Jonathan. Jonathan heard something streaking through the air behind him, whistling as it flew. He rolled forwards, anticipating a strike to his back, but he was not prepared for what came next. There was a light clink, and then a pillar of flame shot up into the atmosphere, easily 1,000 feet wide. Jonathan was lifted off his feet, and his flesh melted into his armor. He was launched high up into the air, and he screamed in pure agony. His armor was glowing a cherry red from the heat, and his enhanced durability was almost a curse, as it refused to let him die. He fell like a shooting star, his body blazing red from the heat. Jonathan swam in and out of consciousness as he fell, and he saw the horizon spinning around him, around and around, the blackness of the ash merging with the sky. The Ashen Citadel was hot this time of year, although that was true almost always. The only times that it was different was when Granath devoured the souls of the damned, creating a miasma of chilling mist that spread through the city streets. Talnor Gran, junior scribe of the Ash Heap's messaging guild, scrambled across a dubious-looking puddle of liquid towards his goal. The city was utterly immense, and all but the most experienced of its citizens became lost now and again. It was made up of twisting alleyways, and towers of dark rock and metal that rose up above the ash like a dark monster squatting on the world. It was not an enticingly created city, but it certainly was imposing, the very vision of what the capital of a circle of hell should be. Of course one could always use the shadow of Granath's Keep, the largest building in the city, to find one's direction. It towered above all else, stretching over 1,000 feet into the sky. It had been raised by dark magic and brute force, constructed an untold number of eons ago, back when this world was young. The city was a melting pot of different races, with only one common denominator. Everyone living there had given themselves, body and soul, to the service of Granath. One could not live in the city without showing proof of their fealty, which meant a written, and system-approved, contract stating that they would never attempt to rebel or harm their overlords. The Messaging Guild was involved in this bit of bureaucracy in a minor function, as it was an off-branch of the larger and more established Scribes Guild. Such mundane things as guilds had reached into the hells from back in the real world, but in any case, even hell needed a government to not devolve into a state of anarchy. Besides, red tape was sometimes worse than any physical torment. Today, Talnor was intimately involved with that red tape. He bore a parcel of important letters, to be delivered straight to the Ashen Throne itself, for Granath's eyes only. They were rumored to contain information about a new distraction within the circle, an up-and-comer known as Jonathan Harlow. The Crown tried to suppress the information, but everyone knew who the man was, although not much about him. Apparently, in some small border town, a man had resisted the efforts of the Circle ruler's agents to enlist him to his service, which led to a series of altercations in which two high-ranking officials in the lower half of the Circle's armies were slain. Talnor shivered as he considered what would happen to the man if he was ever caught. He knew that anyone who disrupted the runnings of this circle, and defied Granath, was destined to die, but there was still a tiny spark of hope within him that someone, anyone, would make a difference. Talnor dashed past the legions of downtrodden and depressed individuals that called this city home. They had good lives, all things considered, but a life of endless servitude was hardly a life by the standards of their past lives. Still, it was better than having their souls devoured, and being turned into monsters. As he neared a junction where one of the main roads that directed commerce within the circle ran through, he was starting to get nervous. He had participated in plenty of harrowing jobs before, delivering messages to border towns, right by the rim, but the dangers posed by the monster that roamed the wastes beyond the edges of the settled land were nothing in comparison to the undisputed hegemon of this circle, Granath the Despoiler. The demographics among the people began to change as he entered the stream of traffic along the road, shifting from the poor and the working class into soldiers and wealthy merchants, returning from their journeys out into the world. All of the food in the ash heaps came from this city, from the hundreds of square miles of agricultural allotments that were kept alive through the sheer power of a cabal of infernal wizards who watered the plants with blood and dark mana. They were known as the Crimson Sect, and they answered only to Granath. None of their number were ever seen by the common folk, and they remained sequestered within the sprawling palace of Granath, but the people of the city were still fearful of them, wary of being taken away to be the fuel for one of their terrible blood sacrifices. Talnor's mind was starting to wander now, which was never good. As a messenger, he had a duty to uphold, no matter how fragile his mental state was at that moment. He picked up his pace, running down the main thoroughfare as quickly as he could without exhausting himself. All of the sights of the city were ignored in his passing, and he only thought about his destination and reaching there on time. He was only about level 30, which was quite weak for a member of one of the guilds, but the opportunities for killing monsters in this area were slim, and the number of ones that would provide ample essence were slimmer still. He would be stuck at this level until he was able to get a promotion, which would allow him to put in a request to be forcibly leveled by some high-ranking member of the army. That would be a day worth remembering, when Talnor finally became someone of import. For now, however, he was stuck with the menial job of transporting messages from one side of the city to the other. Half an hour later, he had crossed into the central part of the city, where the most loyal of Granath's subordinates lived. The area was surrounded by a massive wall, which he had only been able to get past because of his status as a member of the guild. Mansions lined the streets, all leading up the palace in the center. The size of the palace was not only a status symbol, but a simple necessity, given the immense size of the Circle Lord. Talnor fancied that he could hear screaming coming from the dark spires of that accursed citadel, but it might have just been his imagination playing tricks on him. In any case, he was here. Talnor was not spared any glances by the inhabitants of this area, because of his sash denoting him as an official member of his guild. Nobody would dare to forge such a thing, and there was little point either. There was nothing to steal within the palace of Granath, not unless you wanted a slow and agonizing death. Talnor entered the soaring gate of the palace a few minutes later, and had to stop and look up in awe at the magnificent building. It was a style that seemed to invoke infernal grandeur, with grimacing monsters inlaid into the sides of the pillars that supported the width of the titanic ceiling. The ground was lined with red and white marble, which had been exported here at great expense from some hell circle further down the line. Granath liked his luxuries. He kept up his pace, however, as he made his way through the halls of the palace. It was a huge building, and he had to keep moving to be able to meet his deadline. Wretched drudges circled the halls, completing various menial tasks, such as cleaning up the floors or wiping down the various pieces of art around the palace until they were spotless. They were completely devoid of any sort of animus beyond the most basic of motive spirits, and they would endlessly clean these halls. Those people were the ones that the master had taken a special interest in, and had kept their original forms after devouring them. In that way, they could still serve him after death. Talnor hoped that would not be him. He ran past their forms, and kept going, passing by units of soldiers stationed around the hallways. Some of them moved threateningly towards him, but they were only exercising their ability to cause fear, as none of them disputed his legitimacy in being here. Eventually, he found himself standing outside of a pair of titanic brass doors, inlaid with various scenes of grandeur, each with Granath in a central focus. This door was made out of the blood and bone of one of the living mountains that ringed the ash heaps, and was apparently the remains of one of Granath's greatest conquests, back when he had been young. As Talnor approached, the door swung open on its hinges, and revealed a black void inside. Nothing was visible within the throne room, and Talnor took a tentative step inside. Something rustled in the distance, and he yelped in involuntary terror. So, someone had important information for me, and they sent a lowly messenger to deliver it? How interesting. A pale blue light blossomed in the middle of the room, illuminating the bulk of a hideous monster, draped across mounds of leviathan marks and other treasures. Hundreds of feet long, a pale worm writhed in the center of the room, with the upper body of a human, tinged the same pale color as the rest of its body. Its face was blank, save for a slit across its lower half which was the site of its mouth. The body was relative in size to the body of the worm, and was grotesquely affixed to the rest of the creature by a thin line of fused flesh. Its skin was hideously ridged, and covered in the remnants of old injuries, with a few rusting weapons lodged into its body here and there. The creature was quite wide as well, about 20 feet across at its midpoint. The beast swayed from side to side, eyeing up Talnor with curiosity and hunger in its eyes. This was Granath, ruler of the ash heaps. Talnor gulped, and knelt down in front of the monster, holding out his message with his right hand. Something snatched it out of his hand, but he didn't dare to look up. Talnor remained in his groveling position as he heard a wet chortling noise coming from the direction of Granath. The Circle Lord sounded pleased with what he was seeing. Talnor dared to look up, and almost screamed as he saw what was happening. In his mirth, Granath had inadvertently opened his humanoid jaw, revealing what looked to be a writhing mass of iridescent blue feelers with his throat. At least Talnor knew how he sucked people's souls out of their bodies. The worm looked to be displeased by the disrespect in Talnor looking upon him, and he growled in anger. Granath looked down fully at Talnor a moment later, and his aura erupted out of him, crushing Talnor into the ground. Blood leaked out of Talnor's eyes and ears, and the worm loomed over him as he lay there dying. You messengers should know your place. Let this be a lesson to you. I am king here. Granath laughed low and loud, and slammed his aura down fully, causing Talnor to explode in a shower of blood. As the viscera ran across the floor, an unseen force sucked it up into the air, and conveyed it into Granath's mouth. With a sickening slurping noise, the Circle Lord fed. He was in a good mood now, as he had found out more about the latest nuisance in a long line of would-be heroes. The ash heaps was the weakest of the circles, but it was important to stamp out any unrest, no matter how pathetic its origin. Jonathan Harlow's days were numbered. Back in the land near the dungeon, Jonathan had finally landed, and he was lying on the ground, almost comatose. He could barely see, and his retinas were scorched, making even shifting his gaze a torment. Compared to the agony that the rest of his body was in, however, it was nothing. He could only see about 10 feet away from him, and his ears were so damaged to the point that he could barely hear even his own breaths. And of course, the fiery pain that his body was in made sensing anything with his skin nigh impossible. At least it seemed that the attack had taken Downer out of the equation as well. Jonathan slowly started to heal over, but it took entire minutes for him to even be able to get to his feet again, and by that time, some of the soldiers were within a mile of him. Jonathan was in no condition to run, and he desperately searched for a way to avoid the soldiers. However, he could see nothing there. Then he spotted a blackened shape on the ground next to him, the corpse of Towner. However, it shifted slightly, and Jonathan smiled, the motion intensely painful. He knew how to escape now. Jonathan hobbled over towards the other man, and reached his side a few seconds later, preparing a powerful strike with his right fist. Well, it was barely more than a wheeze compared to the roar of his normal attacks, but it was enough to finish the job with how injured Downer was. His fist crunched the now brittle armor into pieces, driving them deep into Downer's brain. Essence rushed into Jonathan, and he breathed in relief as he healed. Some of his skin was still tender, but he was in good shape compared to before. Sending one last look back at his pursuers, he took off, back at his full capacity. Jonathan spent the time checking over his notifications, finding that he had managed to improve quite a few of his skills since entering the dungeon. You have reached Apprentice Rank 1 with martial arts. You have continued to develop and refine your fighting style, testing it against monsters and men alike. In doing so, you have compressed insights into the nature of unarmed combat into a cohesive unit that you can draw upon in battle. Your skill in this field is still quite lacking, but at least you show a small level of competency now. Plus 10 to strength, plus 5 to dexterity. You have access to a martial skill. Impact, rare. You know precisely where to send your strikes to do the maximum amount of damage, whether breaking bones or rending flesh, your strikes always inflict the maximum damage possible. Accept. Y/N. Jonathan closed the first notification and quickly accepted the new skill. It seemed to have no downside, and the description was quite promising. According to it, it would allow him to refine his strikes, and make it so that every last bit of prowess was eked out of it. He doubted that it meant that all of his strikes would instantly kill his enemies, but rather that it would increase his power to the greatest amount possible in the situation that he was in. In any case, he would be able to test it out soon enough once he got away from the soldiers and found a fitting monster. Jonathan opened up his next notification, which was almost as good as the first one. You have reached Student Rank 1 with Flowing Hurricane. Your unique battle style is beginning to come together now into one efficient whole, but you have only scratched the surface of the true meaning of unarmed combat. You have refined this skill against all manner of opponents, which has given you a wide base to build up from. Plus 3 to dexterity, plus 2 to strength. It was almost a mirror image of his martial arts skill rank up, except it was a bit weaker. Still, he was glad for the upgrade. Such things always gave more power than just the stat boosts. He could feel that he had a greater connection to his martial skill now, and that he would be able to use it more effectively. There were a few more notifications as well, but he only briefly read over them as they ran. His other pathway skills had gone up as well, by 2 points into each. It seemed as if his connection to the void element had led to a marked increase within his mana manipulation abilities, as he had not been expecting for it to rank up so quickly now that it was in apprentice rank. Now that he had finished with his inspection, however, a sense of disappointment began to rise over him like a dark tide. He had almost died back there, and if not for his incredible bonuses, he would never have made it out of there. All of it had hinged on luck, and it could have gone either way. Had Downer not been too powerful to die immediately, Jonathan would have been left without a way to gain essence, and would have died to the soldiers. If he had been a bit less durable, he probably would have died to the explosion. In fact, there were very few ways that could have gone in his favor, which made the fact that it did all the more frightening. Jonathan kept running, but inside his mind was in a turmoil. He began to take out his frustration on his body, without even noticing it, speeding up as he ran. Jonathan roared in rage and frustration as he took out his fury on the ground in front of him, and with his full strength unleashed, he left small craters in his wake as he ran, clouding his passage with drifts of black ash. He was far enough away from the soldiers that they were no longer a threat, but he continued running, until eventually his stamina bar ran out, and he collapsed to the ground, utterly exhausted. Jonathan's chest heaved in and out as he breathed, trying to recapture the lost air from his stamina expenditure. He gritted his teeth as he lay there, frustrated at how weak he still was. The simple truth was that no matter how strong he got, there would always be someone above him. That was, unless he became the strongest. Jonathan clenched his fists as he thought this, and conviction welled up within him. He could no longer be satisfied with daydreams of escaping the infinite hells. Even if he escaped into the outside world, there was no way that the gods would let a being like him survive. No, he would have to transcend every boundary that there was to become a force that could not be stopped. It might take an eternity to do so, but Jonathan had all the time in the world. A notification popped up in his vision, which he already knew the subject of. It was a new quest. You have gained a new quest. The strongest. You have begun to embark upon the same metaphysical and egotistical journey as so many other warriors in history. Your goal is simple, to be the very strongest being in the universe. However, such a task is impossible, to the point that nobody has ever completed it. How do you dare to think that you will be the first to do so? The obstacles in your path are legion, and the trials that you will have to go through could break gods. You are a fool and a genius all in one. You are a man fated for an early demise. Reward? Jonathan had not been expecting a quest, but it seemed like the system enjoyed handing out quests when there was a sufficient reason. The difficulty rating was simply a line of question marks, which likely meant that the quest was truly impossible, to the point that there was no name, no hyperbolic designation, that the system could come up with to describe it. Jonathan sighed, and closed the quest. At least some of his angst had dissipated now, and all that he felt was a profound emptiness, with a tiny spark of hope in the middle. He got to his feet, and tried to get his bearings. During his mad dash from the soldiers he hadn't really paid much attention to his surroundings, and now he was lost. He still had the map, but he had likely covered dozens of miles of ground over the last half hour. He was in the middle of what looked to be an abandoned city, and it seemed to be a lot larger than many of the other cities that Jonathan had found. He had not noticed it on the way in because most of the buildings simply looked like mounds of ash, but now that he was unleashing his perception, he was able to pick out the outlines of buildings underneath. He pulled out his map, and took a look at it, seeing if there was anything marked on it. He found the dungeon, and looked at a small circle of land around it, eventually finding his way to what looked like this city. It was a small circle, marked only as danger, in capital red letters. Jonathan sighed, and shook his head. Of course he would end up in a place like this, just through sheer bad luck. So far however, nothing had been apparently dangerous, and Jonathan wasn't sure how much to believe the map. He still wanted to get out of this place as quickly as he could however. He folded up the map, and set off for the way that he had come from, picking up the pace somewhat as the light of the day began to dim. He did not want to be in a place like this after dark. He knew that some of his fear was irrational, as he was likely one of the strongest beings in this area as of the moment, but he still felt uneasy about this lost city. The long shadows of the unnaturally steep ash heaps started to stretch over the land as the day faded into dusk, and a profound coldness entered the air, so cold that it felt unnatural. Such temperatures were not common within the ash heaps, which, while not being a desert per se, was generally hot and dry. However, this was not a meteorological chill, but rather one of the supernatural variety. Jonathan started to send his mana coursing through his arms and into his hands, prepared for anything that was to come. He picked up his pace to a light jog, which for him, was about the speed of a car. Jonathan kept running, but something strange was happening with the landscape around him. The air kept growing colder, and the heaps of ash kept on appearing on the horizon, as if the city never ended. Eventually, he spotted a break in the monotony, in the form of a vast and derelict cathedral, built in the middle of the patch of ruined buildings. For some reason, the ash had not claimed these dwellings as its own, and Jonathan sped towards them, as the air began to bite at his skin. Frost was forming on his armor, and Jonathan knew that the temperature was well below freezing by this point. He was fine for now, but if it kept dropping, then he would be in serious trouble. Jonathan was breathing out streaks of vapor at this point, and icicles of frozen breath were falling to the ground in his wake. He ignored them, and kept his pace steady, eventually reaching the cathedral. The building was even more imposing from close by, and it stretched for hundreds of feet in every direction, made out of dark stone and pieces of twisted metal. Half of the roof was gone, and it was in an oddly spherical shape, as if some great meteor had fallen here in times long past. The temperature immediately went back to normal as he passed through its shattered doors, hanging on their hinges by threads of dark metal, and into the center of the building. It had a sacred, funereal air to it, but not because of worship, but because of death. A sepulchral ambience suffused the area, and Jonathan suddenly felt very small indeed, smaller than he had felt in a long time. It was as if he was suddenly being pressed up against the thin line dividing life from death. The interior of the cathedral was taken up by rows upon rows of graves, dug deep into the ash. Each of them was topped by a thin slab of stone, inlaid with faint scratches that had once been the names of the dead. The graves grew more ornate the closer that they got to the center, with the central grave being a large mausoleum made entirely out of bleached rock, which glistened slightly. Whatever Jonathan had stumbled upon here, it was not something that he had any wish to be part of. As he paused to regard the graves, a scratching noise started up from beneath the ground nearby, and Jonathan jumped. This whole situation was beginning to grow alarming. He turned his back on the graves, and made his way towards the exit. He could tolerate a lot, but the undead were something that he was yet to have to face. As he neared the doors, however, a sudden gust of wind picked up around him, and the doors slammed shut, creaking violently on their twisted hinges. Jonathan ran the rest of the way, and tried to open the doors. However, they were held shut by something other than simple gravity, and they would not budge, even in the face of his incredible strength. Jonathan turned around, only to see the ash beginning to shift atop the many graves that lined the interior of the cathedral. He frowned, and started towards the far end of the cathedral, where the large hole in the roof was. If he got to that, then he could possibly escape through it. However, the monsters in the graves had other plans. One of them emerged from the ground in front of Jonathan, hissing low through rotted lips and teeth. It reached out, and grabbed his leg, moving with a speed and strength that seemed far beyond its means. Jonathan tore his foot free, scanning the monster as he moved. Ashen Thrall, Basic. Level 60. Jonathan gritted his teeth and kept running. He was surrounded by hundreds of monsters that were all quite high-leveled. He had no idea what this place was, but he knew that it was quite dangerous. He cursed his luck for having drawn him here, but he knew that it was really his stupidity that had led to this situation. Jonathan had been too engrossed in his own woes to notice where he was going, and as a result he had entered this city, filled with the spirits of the dead. As Jonathan ran, the mounds of ash began to open all around him, and bony hands reached out of the ground, looking for his flesh. Jonathan weaved around the morass of grasping hands, and raced through the rows, heading for the edge of the cathedral walls. He was nearing them a few seconds later, but he felt an invisible force grasp him by the midsection, and tear him off his feet, tossing him through the air and back towards the center of the room. The noise of cracking stone echoed out from the mausoleum, and spiderweb cracks raced up and down the stone. With a clattering boom, the stone exploded outwards, and revealed a regal-looking undead, clad in priestly vestments. It was 9 feet tall, and wielded a large staff in one hand, topped with some piece of religious iconography that glistened in the baleful light that surrounded its form. Four green wisps darted to and fro around the creature, and its face was twisted in glee as it clenched its fist, trying to crush Jonathan between its invisible fingers of force. However, Jonathan might have been too weak to resist the pull, but he was more than durable enough to not be harmed by the attack. It felt a bit uncomfortable, but that was all. He suspected that it was not intended as an actual damaging strike but as a utility spell for unbalancing one's enemies. Jonathan gritted his teeth, and pulsed his mana out and into the spell surrounding him, sending veins of purple pulsing through the air. The spell cracked open a moment later, letting Jonathan drop to the ground. Legions of the slavering undead surrounded him, however their leader regarded him with an arrogant glare. "Why do you wake us, mortal? Do your people not still tell tales of us to their children, to prevent them from wandering out into the cold embrace of the night?" The leader said, in tones that seemed slightly aristocratic. "I don't even know who you are," Jonathan responded. He knew that diplomacy was a foregone hope, but he still wanted to delay a bit so that he could come up with a plan. "I was running from my enemies, and I ended up in that city, without knowing what exactly it was." "You lie," the undead said, frowning. It raised one hand, as if to smite Jonathan, but he kept speaking. "I do not. Whatever your city once was, it is not only a footnote in the maps of this world. You are mostly unknown, save as some sort of blank spot on the world, a place where not to go." "My intentions were honest in coming here," Jonathan replied. His mana was at his fingertips, and he was ready to fight his way out of here if necessary. Other than the leader, the undead here were nothing more than slavering monstrosities, and it was the only real threat to Jonathan. He could always outrun the main force of the undead. However, that telekinetic attack would be quite annoying. Jonathan waited for the undead to say something, but it seemed lost in thought. He took a quick look around himself, finding that all of the undead were still, as if awaiting orders from their master. In fact, it was likely that they were all controlled by the monster standing in front of Jonathan. He smiled inwardly, but kept this revelation to himself. If he was able to defeat the leader, then he would be able to leave this place. "You might have been innocent in your trespass, but that doesn't excuse your crime. We have slumbered here for countless years, and we do not take those who wake us kindly." The monster snapped its fingers, and the undead around Jonathan came to life, snarling and hissing at the air. They shambled towards him, moving at grotesquely sped-up paces, which caused their forms to shift strangely through the air. It was like being in a low-budget horror movie. Jonathan ignored the monsters however, and charged the leader, his fists blazing with purple energy and the red light of his rune. He drove his fist into the monster's torso, but all he achieved was sending it a few paces backwards, without really damaging it. The energy had been channeled out through the monster and into its thralls, judging by the fact that 3 of them fell to the ground, lifeless, behind Jonathan. The monster laughed, and waved its hand, sending Jonathan flying through the air. A series of necrotic bolts surged out of its fingertips over the next second, heading for Jonathan's vulnerable form. The attack impacted his armor, and sent a freezing pain through his bones and skin, causing his body to lock up midair. He landed amid the undead, who began to batter him with their fists and feet. He was paralyzed for a moment, but as the paralysis wore off, he tore his way free from the monsters, and began lashing out with his fists. None of them had any sort of technique, and they simply stood there and took the attacks, trying mindlessly to get to him. It was an effective strategy, seeing as they were immune to pain, and it was quite disconcerting for Jonathan to be battering one of the creatures while it kept throwing itself at him, even with its head half split open. He kept sending his mana to his fists in a never-ending stream, vaporizing the flesh that his fists touched. The leader of the undead started to circle Jonathan's position, the monsters parting in front of him like a river before a rock, and began to direct the undead in a more personal fashion, sending them in waves rather than letting them keep to their own devices. Jonathan was forced to adapt to the new strategies, and he was slowly being overrun by the undead. He had little room to dodge, and only his armor and superior durability was keeping him intact. So far, he had not taken any serious damage, but his body was bruised all over, and he was starting to lose health points to the monsters. Despite their appearance, they were quite tough and strong. Jonathan had no idea how many of the creatures he had taken out by now, but their numbers seemed to be endless, and there was no hope in sight for him. Eventually, Jonathan made a snap decision, and leaped out of the mess of undead bodies, and towards the leader. The creature sent out another one of its invisible hands towards Jonathan, but he sent his mana in a bow wave before himself, unbinding the attack midair. His fists began to light up with power, and he landed in front of the monster, bringing his fist down like a thunderbolt. It slammed into the undead's upraised arms, and pile-drived the creature into the ground, cracking the stone underneath it, the remnants of the mausoleum that it had emerged from. Then it hit the ash, and the monster accelerated downwards, carving out a crater into the ground. It leaped out of the pit, its skin a patchwork of glowing scars, and punched Jonathan, imbuing its strike with its telekinetic abilities. The attack sent its force through his armor, rather than glancing off it, and his ribs broke underneath the force of the strike. Jonathan was catapulted backwards, and he landed, dazed, on top of a group of undead, who quickly began to lash out at him with their festering hands. Jonathan forced himself to snap back to reality, and he kicked away the monsters, getting his feet underneath himself. Jonathan dodged around the clumsy blows of the nearby monsters, and headed back towards the undead leader. His only hope was to defeat the sapient undead, as it held the reins of all of the other monsters in this area. If he tried to escape through the hole in the roof, the monster would just pull him back in with its telekinetic abilities, for the lesser undead to devour him. No, he needed to cut off the head of the snake, here and now. The undead leader grinned at him, its teeth showing, and slammed its palm against the ground, sending a crack racing across the ash towards him. The ground rumbled beneath Jonathan, and he dived out of the way as a rapidly growing canyon extended outwards from the monster's palm. It seemed to reach down into some underground section of the cathedral, as it was far deeper than it should have been, given the creature's power. Ethereal green smoke began to rise out of the ground, and the undead that it touched began to speed up. Jonathan narrowly avoided the strikes of a nearby monster, but only barely, as it had become almost as fast as him. This was rapidly becoming dangerous. Jonathan began to draw upon his battle trance and his martial skill in order to weave his way around the many strikes coming his way, and even then, he began to take damage as he moved. A withered fist, a bony foot slamming into his legs, all of the attacks began to mount, and they were starting to do serious damage now. Jonathan did not let his fear overtake him, however, and he maintained steely focus on his target. He tried as best he could to mitigate the damage, but he knew that to win, he would need to be willing to take it. In any case, it was nothing new. Jonathan punched the monsters out of the way as he neared them, and he kept up the pace, moving quite quickly for someone who was fighting their way through a horde of super-powered undead. He focused on his own prowess, trying to maximize the impact of every one of his strikes, aided by his new skill. What it did was allow him to pinpoint the exact spot where he would be able to feasibly land a strike with the most impact, but it required a lot of focus on his point, and seemed to be designed to mesh with his battle state. However, it still was not enough to do much. He was going to die at this rate if he did not improve his pace, and even the addition of his skill was too little to do much. If he used Smite now, he would run out before he was able to do any lasting damage to the leader of the undead, which meant that he was adrift here. Even if he broke the bank in terms of free stat points, the difference still might not be enough. As a fist almost dislocated his jaw, coming in from a blind spot, and moving quickly enough to evade his superior senses, Jonathan's mind embarked upon a sudden path that seemed to be driven as much by instinct as anything else. Tendrils of his void-tainted divinity snaked up into his brain, reaching towards the runes that made up his skill. His impact skill was made up of a concentrated tapestry of various runes, but near the center, there was one that he recognized. The rune of hatred. It seemed to be integral to the targeting part of his skill, meshing in with the desire to harm his opponent in the most effective way possible. His divinity lanced into the rune, and empowered it beyond its normal limits, briefly supercharging the skill. For a moment it was like he was some god of perception, with every vulnerable spot on the nearby enemies laid bare. He moved as if in a trance, and his strikes landed with a conceptual weight that went beyond the limits of the skill. Bodies exploded as his fist struck, but the sudden power was all too quickly gone, replaced with a stabbing pain. Blood ran down his face, and Jonathan almost vomited as nearly a quarter of his health bar was ripped from his body. However, his skill had resulted in the desired effect, and his path was momentarily free of any of the undead. Jonathan ran forwards, ignoring the pain stabbing into his body, and headed for his quarry. The undead leader was looking at him in shock, but it quickly reined in the emotion, and prepared an attack, gathering dark power between its skeletal hands. Jonathan kept running, weaving together his mana within his core to respond with whatever attack was coming his way. As he approached the undead, Jonathan began to sense a profound wrongness coming from the air in front of the creature, the result of the spell that it was using. As the dark orb of power grew and grew in front of the undead, the air began to twist and warp before his very eyes. Jonathan began to send his mana forward in a concentrated spike of power, but it had little effect on what was happening before his very eyes. The undead laughed, and then spoke a single word that was drowned out by the noise that the spell caused mere moments later. The ball of energy ruptured, and a myriad of howling shadows poured out of it, sweeping across the ground towards Jonathan. He crossed his arms, and wreathed himself in warding mana, but he was still taken off his feet by the attack. The shadows sent a deep chill straight to the center of his body, causing him to lose health at a precipitous rate. Coupled with the weakness from supercharging his skill, Jonathan was in dire straits. Jonathan landed heavily 100 feet away, his body chilled to the bone. He tried to get to his feet, but his muscles and joints were unresponsive, the result of the supreme chill. He forced his mana into his body, repeating the same thing that he had done during the dungeon to cleanse poison from his system, and he managed to burn the coldness out of himself, causing him great pain. Jonathan growled in anger, and shook his head, clearing the fugue from his body. He took off, running at the undead, a little bit tired of how this seemed to be his ultimate response to any threat. Seeing as he was predominantly a melee-based fighter, there really wasn't much else that he could do other than charge his opponents. In any case, his build was certainly made for such a thing, with his monstrous durability and titanic strength. However, he was finding that if an opponent possessed sufficient magical strength, then his fighting style became slightly annoying. As he ran, the other undead tried to pile on top of him, stopping him from moving forwards. Jonathan did not bother engaging them, instead leaping over their heads into the few clear spots of ground that were left. The monsters seemed too dull to fill those spots before he landed, which was good for him. Jonathan leapfrogged the rest of the way, fending off strikes from the monsters as he went. His health bar was below half at this point, which was quite concerning. Jonathan reached the leader a few seconds later, with his fists coated in mana and divinity. As the monster began to thrust out its hands towards Jonathan, ready to send him flying backwards once more, Jonathan sent a blade of mana out from the tip of his right hand, and slashed it down through the air, slicing through the burgeoning spell. It had the effect that he had been looking for, and the telekinetic hand was severed in two, unable to move. The monster was briefly stunned, and Jonathan drove his fist into its abdomen, trying to get through its unnaturally tough skin. His divinity, coupled with his mana, was able to get past that however, and he poured as much as he could into the attack. A shockwave of purple and red energy blossomed outwards from his fist, and knocked the monster off its feet, sending it skidding across the ash. Jonathan followed up with his strike and leaped into the air, bringing his fists down together in a mighty smash that folded the undead over in half as he landed. Jonathan was too late to stop its spellcraft however, and the undead thrust a blade of onyx light into his stomach, phasing through his armor. It did not physically harm him, but his body began to seize up as primordial coldness spread throughout his body and soul. Jonathan gritted his teeth, trying to move away. The coldness was tied to the blade and if he got off it, then he would be able to escape. The attack was not taking any health off, but it was rooting him in place, which was quite a bad situation to be in. "You are stronger than you appear, interloper," the undead leader said. It seemed to be completely unfazed by the hole in its stomach. "However, your journey ends now. You have cost me much in the lives of my followers, but I will restore justice to them now." Jonathan tried to speak, but his lips would not move. He was disgusted with the whole thing, of this foul monster daring to speak about justice and the lives of his followers. None of them were even real. They were all already dead. Jonathan snarled, and triggered his final skill.